Hello there and welcome. I'm so glad you found your way here tonight. Before we begin, take a moment to get comfortable. Adjust your pillow, let your body settle into whatever position feels right. There's no rush. We have all the time in the world. Where in the world are you watching from? A quiet bedroom as the night deepens, a cozy corner where the weight of the day is finally lifting. Wherever you are, you're exactly where you need to be. Tonight, we're going to explore one of the most profound economic collapses in human history, the Great Depression, and a question that has echoed through nearly a century. What really happened on those terrible days in October 1929, when the stock market crashed and, according to legend, millionaires threw themselves from Manhattan skyscrapers? We'll discover the reality behind the myths, understand the complex chain of events that brought a roaring decade to its knees, and contemplate what this moment taught us about prosperity, fragility, and the human capacity for both greed and resilience. We'll meet the people who lived through it, walk the streets of a transformed America, and slowly, carefully, piece together how the world changed forever. But don't worry, this isn't going to be a frantic recounting of economic chaos or a sensational exploration of tragedy. Instead, we'll move slowly and carefully through the 1920s, through the crash itself, and through the long, difficult years that followed. We'll take our time with the numbers, the stories, the quiet desperation, and unexpected hope. By the end, I think you'll find that the Great Depression was not just about an economy failing, but about humanity being tested, and ultimately, about how we learn to rebuild from the ruins. If you enjoy these calm explorations of history's most profound moments, a like and subscribe really helps reach others seeking the same peaceful way to end their day. And to those already subscribed, thank you for being part of this community of thoughtful listeners, so settle in. Let your shoulders drop away from your ears. Take a slow breath, in through your nose, out through your mouth. And let's begin our slow drift through the 1920s, through the crash, through the depression, and toward understanding. There's nowhere you need to be, no deadlines to meet. Just listen and let the story unfold like a long, quiet conversation between old friends. Let it wash over you. If you drift away, that's perfectly fine. That's what we're here for. Let's begin in 1920, when the world was young again. The Great War had ended just 2 years before. 4 years of unimaginable slaughter in European trenches had finally ceased, and America, largely untouched by the physical devastation that had transformed France and Belgium into moonscapes, emerged as something it had never quite been before, a true world power. Young men returned home. Factories that had churned out weapons shifted to consumer goods, and something remarkable happened. The American economy didn't just recover, it exploded. They called it the Roaring Twenties, and the name fit perfectly. Everything seemed louder, brighter, faster than it had been before. Consider the transformation. In 1920, most American homes didn't have electricity. By 1929, 2/3 did. Radio was born and grew from a curiosity to a necessity. By decade's end, over 12 million American households owned radios, gathering around them in the evening like families once gathered around fireplaces. The first commercial radio broadcast happened in 1920, and within 5 years, Americans were listening to music, news, and entertainment beamed invisibly through the air. Cars transformed from luxury items to necessities. Henry Ford's assembly line had already revolutionized manufacturing, but in the 1920s, the automobile truly came into its own. In 1920, there were about 8 million registered vehicles in America. By 1929, there were 23 million. Roads were paved, gas stations sprouted, entire industries emerged to serve this new mobility. Motels, roadside diners, highway systems. The country physically changed shape. Cities grew upward and outward simultaneously. The skyscraper, that uniquely American architectural achievement, reached new heights. The Chrysler Building, the Empire State Building, these monuments to ambition and engineering were products of the late 20s, when it seemed nothing was too tall to build, no dream too large to realize. Manhattan's skyline transformed into the jagged, soaring profile we still recognize today, and everywhere there was music. Jazz poured out of Harlem and New Orleans and Chicago, a genuinely new American art form that felt as revolutionary as the age itself. Louis Armstrong, Duke Ellington, Bessie Smith, they created a soundtrack for a generation that wanted to dance, to celebrate, to forget the grim years of war and influenza and sacrifice. Speakeasies thrived despite, or perhaps because of, prohibition. Young women bobbed their hair, shortened their skirts, and claimed freedoms their mothers had never known. They called them flappers, and they symbolized the age, bold, modern, uninterested in the stuffy Victorian morality of the past. But underneath all this glittering prosperity, underneath the jazz and the skyscrapers and the shiny new automobiles, something else was building, something less visible but no less real. The very mechanisms that created such wealth were also creating extraordinary fragility. The economy was growing, yes, but it was growing on foundations that were far less solid than anyone wanted to believe. Let's think about that for a moment. Let's consider what prosperity actually means, and whether an economy can grow too fast, become too hot, burn too bright. Because that's where our story really begins, not in the crash itself, but in the years of boom that made the crash possible. To understand what happened in 1929, we need to understand how people in the 1920s thought about money, investing, and the stock market, because their thinking was both remarkably modern and dangerously naive. The stock market had existed for a long time, of course, but in the 1920s it became something new, a pathway to wealth for ordinary people. Before the war, stock investing had been largely the domain of the wealthy, the connected, the already rich. But in the 20s, stock ownership democratized. Brokerage firms opened in smaller cities. Newspapers published stock tables. Radio announcers read off closing prices. Investing became not just acceptable for the middle class, but fashionable, even patriotic. You weren't just making money. You were participating in American prosperity. The numbers seem to prove this optimism was justified. Between 1924 and 1929, the Dow Jones Industrial Average more than tripled. Companies that had never paid a dividend suddenly seemed like solid investments because their stock prices kept rising. And if stock prices kept rising, well, why wouldn't they keep rising? This was America in the modern age. We had conquered distance with the automobile, conquered darkness with electricity, conquered silence with the radio. Why shouldn't we conquer poverty with the stock market? Here's where things became interesting and dangerous. Most people who invested in the stock market in the late 1920s didn't actually have the money to buy stocks outright. Instead, they bought, quote, zero. Let me explain how this worked, because it's crucial to understanding the crash. Imagine you want to buy $100 worth of stock. In a normal transaction, you'd give your broker $100 and you'd receive stock certificates worth $100. Simple. But margin buying was different. With margin buying, you might put down only $10 of your own money. Your broker would lend you the other $90, using the stock itself as collateral. If the stock went up to, say, $120, you could sell, pay back the $90 loan, and pocket $30 in profit, a 300% return on your $10 investment. This sounds like a magnificent system, and when stock prices are rising, it is. You can leverage small amounts of money into large gains. But notice what happens if the stock price falls. If that $100 stock drops to $80, you've not only lost your initial $10 investment, you've also lost $10 more than you invested. Your broker will issue what's called a quote 1, demanding you immediately deposit more money to cover the loss. If you can't, the broker sells your stock to recover the loan and you're wiped out. Now imagine millions of people, from factory workers to dentists to housewives, all buying stocks on margin, all convinced that prices will keep rising forever. Imagine that web of debt spreading across the entire economy, with everyone owing money to someone else, all based on the assumption that stock prices only go up. By 1929, it's estimated that about $8.5 billion worth of stock purchases were being made on margin. To put that in perspective, that was more than the entire amount of currency circulating in the United States at the time. The market had become a vast pyramid of borrowed money, balanced precariously on the expectation of eternal growth. There were voices of caution. Some economists warned that stocks were overvalued, that the market was detached from underlying economic reality. But these voices were drowned out by the chorus of optimism. In March 1929, the Yale economist Irving Fisher, who would become infamous for his timing, declared that stock prices have reached what looks like a permanently high plateau. That phrase, permanently high plateau, captures the mood perfectly. The idea that what goes up might come down seemed quaintly old-fashioned, the worry of people who didn't understand this new, modern economy. Throughout the summer and early fall of 1929 there were tremors, small dips in the market that recovered quickly, but that made nervous investors slightly more nervous. Each dip was followed by reassurance from market experts, from government officials, from business leaders. Everything was fine. The fundamentals were sound. This was just natural market fluctuation. Keep investing. Keep believing. And then came October. Thursday, October 24th, 1929. The date would become seared into American memory as quote 4, though at the time, as the sun rose over New York City, few people knew they were about to witness history. The morning began badly. From the moment the New York Stock Exchange opened at 10 o'clock, selling pressure was intense. This wasn't entirely unexpected. The previous week had seen some significant drops, but the volume and velocity of selling on this particular morning caught everyone off guard. Within the first hour, nearly 3 million shares had changed hands, and prices were falling precipitously. Let me paint you a picture of the scene. The New York Stock Exchange occupied a grand neoclassical building at 11 Wall Street, with a trading floor that was normally a place of controlled chaos, men in suits shouting, paper tickets flying, a kind of organized frenzy. But on this morning the frenzy lost its organization. As stock prices on the board fell further and further, the shouting grew louder, more desperate. Traders tried to process the tsunami of sell orders coming in, but they were overwhelmed. Outside the exchange, crowds began to gather. This was unusual. The stock market wasn't typically a spectator sport. But word spread through Lower Manhattan that something significant was happening, and people came to watch, to wait for news, to see what would happen to their investments. By noon, the crowd had grown large enough that police were called to maintain order. The ticker tape machines, those mechanical devices that printed out stock prices on narrow strips of paper, simply couldn't keep up. Under normal circumstances, they could handle about 285 words per minute. But the volume of trading was so enormous that the tickers fell behind, further and further behind until they were running hours late. This created a terrifying situation for investors. They knew prices were falling, but they didn't know which stocks or by how much. They were selling blind in a panic, which only accelerated the panic. By 11:30 that morning, some of America's most powerful bankers were gathering at the offices of J.P. Morgan and Company, just across from the exchange. Thomas Lamont, Albert Wiggin, Charles Mitchell, William Potter. These were the men who, in a very real sense, controlled American finance. They met in private discussing what could be done. The market was in free fall. Something had to be done. And here's where the story takes an interesting turn. Because these bankers did something. At about 1:30 in the afternoon, Richard Whitney, the vice president of the exchange and a representative of the banking consortium, walked onto the trading floor and began placing large buy orders for blue-chip stocks, US Steel, General Electric, others, at prices significantly above the current market. The signal was clear. The bankers were supporting the market. Major financial institutions were stepping in to stem the panic. And remarkably, it worked, at least temporarily. The market stabilized, prices began to recover. By the closing bell at 3 o'clock, the Dow had recovered much of its losses. The newspapers the next morning were cautiously optimistic. The banking elite had demonstrated their power to steady the market. Crisis averted, or so it seemed. Friday was better. Saturday, yes, the market was open on Saturdays then, saw relative calm. When Monday came around, people dared to hope that the worst was over. Perhaps this had been just another correction, a necessary shakeout of weak investors. The kind of temporary dip that markets experience. The bankers had shown they could maintain order, but underneath the temporary calm, nothing had actually changed. The fundamental problems, overvaluation, excessive margin debt, an economy that wasn't as strong as people believed, remained. The intervention by the banks had been impressive, but it was like putting a finger in a dam that was already cracking along its entire length. Monday, October 28th, would be worse than Thursday. And Tuesday, October 29th, the date that would go down in history as Black Tuesday, would be catastrophic. But we'll come to that. For now, picture that Thursday evening, October 24th, as the sun set over Manhattan. Traders and investors exhausted, shaken but relieved. The crisis had passed, or so they believed. Let that image settle for a moment, because they had no idea what was coming. October 29th, 1929, Black Tuesday, the day the world changed. Let's approach this carefully, because the mythology around this day is so powerful that it's easy to lose sight of what actually happened. Yes, it was devastating. Yes, it marked a turning point. But let's understand it as the people living through it experienced it, not with the hindsight of history, but with the confusion and fear of the moment. Monday, October the 28th, had already been terrible. The market had dropped 13% in a single day, losing the gains of the entire previous year. Investors who had been wiped out called their brokers, begging for more time to meet margin calls. But the brokers had their own debts to service. They sold the stocks regardless of the pleas. The selling fed more selling in a vicious spiral, but Tuesday was worse, much worse. From the opening bell, the selling was relentless. Not panicked exactly. By this point, panic had given way to something more resigned, more mechanical. Investors knew they had to sell. Brokers knew they had to liquidate margin accounts. Everyone was trapped in a machine of their own making, and the machine was tearing itself apart. The ticker tape fell behind almost immediately, eventually running more than 4 hours late. Imagine being an investor, trying to decide what to do, and having no idea what your stocks are actually worth. The information vacuum only intensified the fear. The crowds outside the exchange were larger than they had been on Thursday. Police estimated that over 10,000 people gathered in the financial district, watching, waiting, hoping for some miracle that wouldn't come. Inside, the trading floor was chaos that verged on pandemonium. Grown men wept. Others shouted themselves hoarse. The noise was deafening. 16 million shares changed hands that day. To understand how extraordinary this number was, consider that a typical trading day might see 3 or 4 million shares traded. The exchange's systems simply weren't built for this volume. The clerks who recorded trades by hand couldn't keep up. The runners who carried slips of paper between traders were overwhelmed. The entire infrastructure of the market was collapsing under the weight of its own activity. By the closing bell, the Dow had fallen another 12%. In just 2 days, Monday and Tuesday, the market had lost nearly a quarter of its value. Billions of dollars in wealth, at least on paper, had simply vanished. Fortunes that had been built over the course of the decade evaporated in hours. And here's where we need to address the famous image: millionaires jumping from windows. The truth is more complex than the legend. There were suicides in the days and weeks following the crash, yes. The most famous was that of J.J. Reardon, president of the County Trust Company, who took his own life on November 8th. Others followed. But the image of bodies raining down from skyscrapers is more myth than reality. In fact, suicide rates didn't spike dramatically in late 1929. They would rise later, during the depths of the Depression in the early 1930s. But the immediate aftermath of the crash didn't see the epidemic of Wall Street suicides that popular imagination has preserved. What did happen was something more prosaic, but in some ways more tragic. Ordinary people, middle-class investors who had believed the promises of endless prosperity, lost everything. Life savings disappeared. College funds evaporated. Retirements that had seemed secure became impossible. These weren't just millionaires being ruined, though many of them were, but dentists and shopkeepers and school teachers who had trusted the market with their futures. The newspapers in the days following Black Tuesday tried to make sense of what had happened. Some blamed excessive speculation. Others pointed to fundamental weaknesses in the economy that the bull market had masked. Still others insisted this was just a temporary setback, that recovery was just around the corner. President Herbert Hoover, speaking on October 25th before Black Tuesday, had declared that the fundamental business of the country is on a sound and prosperous basis. After Tuesday, he tried to maintain that optimism, but it rang increasingly hollow. By the end of October 1929, the stock market had lost about 40% of its value from its September peak. But here's something crucial to understand. This wasn't the bottom, not even close. The market would continue to fall, with occasional rallies that sparked false hope, for nearly 3 more years. By the summer of 1932, the Dow would hit bottom at about 41 points, down nearly 90% from its 1929 high of 381. Think about that. 90%. If you had $100,000 invested at the peak, you'd have $10,000 left at the bottom, but we're getting ahead of ourselves. In November 1929, as the smoke cleared from the crash, most people still didn't understand what had happened or what it meant. They couldn't see the future. They couldn't know that the crash wasn't just a market event, but the beginning of a transformation that would reshape American life, American politics, American identity. Let's move forward, slowly, and see how that transformation unfolded. In the immediate aftermath of the crash, this was an odd sense of normalcy punctuated by moments of unreality. Christmas. 1929 arrived about 2 months after Black Tuesday. Department stores still decorated their windows, families still gathered for holiday meals, radio programs still played cheerful music. On the surface, life continued. But underneath, things were beginning to change in ways that would become more and more apparent as winter turned to spring. The stock market crash had destroyed a great deal of paper wealth, but paper wealth isn't the same as real wealth. Factories still existed. Farmland still produced crops. Workers still had skills. The physical capacity of the American economy hadn't disappeared. So why didn't everything just bounce back? This question puzzled economists then and continues to fascinate them now, because the answer reveals something profound about how modern economies actually work. Here's what began to happen, slowly at first, then with gathering momentum. Banks started to fail, not immediately and not all at once, but steadily. Remember, these banks had made loans to stock investors who could no longer repay them. They had invested their own capital in the market. They were part of that web of debt we talked about earlier, and now the web was tearing. When a bank failed, depositors lost their savings. There was no FDIC insurance back then. No government guarantee. When people lost their savings, they stopped spending. When they stopped spending, businesses lost customers. When businesses lost customers, they laid off workers. When workers lost their jobs, they couldn't pay their debts. The spiral was underway. Businesses that had expanded during the boom years found themselves with excess capacity. The automobile industry, for instance, had built factories anticipating ever-increasing demand. But car sales were plummeting. Why buy a new car when you're worried about making next month's rent? Factories cut production, then cut wages, then cut workers. By the spring of 1930, unemployment was rising noticeably, not catastrophically yet, but enough to worry. Agriculture, which had never fully participated in the prosperity of the 1920s anyway, got worse. Commodity prices fell as demand weakened. Farmers who had borrowed money to expand during the war years, when food prices were high, now found themselves unable to service their debts. Farm foreclosures began to increase. In the Midwest, in the Great Plains, families that had worked the same land for generations found themselves evicted, their property auctioned off to pay creditors. International trade was collapsing too. This is a part of the story that often gets overlooked, but it's crucial. The crash on Wall Street had ripple effects across the globe. European economies still recovering from World War I had been sustained in part by American investment. When that investment dried up, their economies weakened. When their economies weakened, they bought less American exports. And crucially, they began erecting trade barriers, trying to protect their domestic industries. The United States responded with the Smoot-Hawley Tariff in 1930, which raised import duties on thousands of goods. This was meant to protect American jobs, but it ended up reducing global trade, which hurt everyone. The feedback loops were vicious and self-reinforcing. Every attempt to protect oneself, whether a bank calling in loans, a business cutting costs, or a government raising tariffs, made sense from an individual perspective but worsened the collective situation. Economists would later call this the quote, six. When everyone tries to save money simultaneously, the lack of spending causes incomes to fall, making everyone poorer. But in 1930, this wasn't yet understood. People were doing what seemed rational and collectively creating a disaster. President Hoover believed the solution was to maintain confidence. If people just believed things would get better, they would start spending and investing again, and things actually would get better. It was a kind of faith in the power of positive thinking applied to economics. He convened meetings with business leaders, urging them not to cut wages. He made public statements about the fundamentals of the economy being sound. He believed, genuinely believed, that the crisis was primarily psychological, and that the solution was therefore psychological too. But reality was proving stubborn. Confidence doesn't pay the bills when you have no income. Optimism doesn't feed your children when you've lost your job and your savings. Throughout 1930 and into 1931, the situation deteriorated. The unravelling that had begun with the stock market crash was spreading through the entire economy, touching every sector, every region, every class. The Depression, though people didn't call it that yet, still hoping it was just a recession, just a temporary downturn, was deepening. And the worst was still to come. As 1930 turned into 1931, the slow economic decline accelerated into something more alarming: a full-scale banking crisis. This was when the Depression moved from being a severe recession into something that threatened the entire financial system. Banks, in a healthy economy, perform a kind of everyday magic. They take money from depositors and lend it out to borrowers. The depositors think their money is safely tucked away, available whenever they need it. The borrowers use that same money for immediate needs: buying a house, starting a business, purchasing equipment. The bank makes money from the interest charged on loans, some of which it pays back to depositors. Everyone benefits, as long as everyone trusts the system. But this system has a fundamental vulnerability. At any given moment, a bank doesn't actually have all of its depositors' money sitting in a vault. Most of it has been lent out. This is called fractional reserve banking, and under normal circumstances it works fine because not everyone wants their money at the same time. But what happens when trust evaporates? What happens when depositors start to worry that their bank might fail? They rush to withdraw their money. This is called a bank run, and it's self-fulfilling. Even a perfectly healthy bank can't survive if all its depositors show up simultaneously demanding their cash, because that cash has been lent out. The bank has to sell assets quickly, often at loss, to raise cash. If it can't raise enough fast enough, it fails, and when people see a bank failing, they start worrying about their banks, and the runs spread. This is what began happening in late 1930 and intensified through 1931. The first major wave of bank failures hit in November and December 1930. Over 600 banks failed in those 2 months alone. These weren't just small rural banks, though plenty of those failed too. Some were substantial institutions that had seemed rock solid. The Bank of United States in New York, despite its misleading name, it was a private commercial bank, not a government institution, failed in December 1930, taking down $200 million in deposits, affecting over 400,000 depositors. It was the largest bank failure in American history to that point. Imagine you're a depositor in 1931. You've watched banks fail. You've heard stories of people losing everything. Your own bank seems fine, but so did all those other banks right up until they closed their doors. what do? The rational decision, the self-protective decision, is to withdraw your money and hide it somewhere safe, maybe literally under a mattress or buried in the backyard or locked in a home safe. But when millions of people make this rational individual decision, they collectively destroy the banking system. As banks failed, the money supply contracted. This is a crucial point. In a modern economy, most money isn't physical currency. It's bank deposits, which can be moved around by check or electronic transfer. When banks fail and those deposits disappear, money effectively vanishes from the economy. And when there's less money circulating, prices fall, which sounds good until you realize it means businesses earn less revenue, which means they pay workers less, or lay them off entirely, which means those workers can't pay their debts, which means more bank failures, another vicious spiral. The Federal Reserve, America's central bank, created in 1913 partly to prevent exactly this kind of banking crisis, failed to respond adequately. This wasn't because the people running it were incompetent or malicious. They genuinely believed they were following sound policy. But they were operating on economic theories that, in hindsight, were exactly wrong for the situation. They thought maintaining the gold standard was paramount. They thought letting weak banks fail would make the system stronger. They thought the solution was to restrict credit, not expand it. Every one of these beliefs turned out to be disastrous. By 1932, over 5,000 banks had failed, 5,000 institutions that had held people's savings, their trust, their futures. The effect on American psychology was profound. A generation learned not to trust banks, a mistrust that would persist for decades, even after the worst was over, even after reforms and insurance. The people who lived through the banking crisis remained wary. They kept cash at home. They avoided debt. They remembered. The banking crisis also revealed the inadequacy of the American financial regulatory system. There was no deposit insurance, no lender of last resort function effectively operating, no coordinated response. Each bank was essentially on its own, and each depositor had to hope their bank was one of the lucky survivors. This wasn't just an economic failure. It was a failure of governance, of institutions, of the frameworks that were supposed to protect people from exactly this kind of catastrophe. As we moved deeper into 1931 and 1932, as the banking system teetered on the edge of complete collapse, ordinary people faced impossible choices: trust and lose everything, or withdraw and help destroy the system. There were no good options, only less bad ones. And through it all, life had to continue somehow. Bills still came due, children still needed food, winter still arrived indifferent to human suffering. Let's talk about what unemployment meant in the 1930s. Not the statistics, though, we'll get to those. Let's talk about what it meant to be unemployed during the Depression, what it felt like, what it did to people. First, the numbers, because they're staggering. When the stock market crashed in October 1929, the unemployment rate was about 3%. By 1930, it was approaching 9%. By 1931, it was over 15%. And by 1933, at the depths of the Depression, it peaked at approximately 25%. 1 in 4 American workers couldn't find a job. In some cities, in some industries, it was worse. In Toledo, Ohio, unemployment hit 80% at its worst. In Akron, home of the rubber industry, it reached 60%. But these percentages, as shocking as they are, don't capture the human reality. In the 1930s, there was no unemployment insurance, no food stamps, no welfare safety net as we understand it today. When you lost your job, you lost your income, immediately and completely. Your savings, if you had any, would last a few weeks or months. Then what? For many families, quote 10 meant asking for help from relatives who might be in nearly as bad a position. It meant selling possessions, furniture, jewellery, anything of value, to buy food. It meant moving to cheaper housing, then moving again to even cheaper housing, then being evicted when you couldn't make even that rent. It meant children going to school hungry, if they went to school at all, because what was the point when there were no jobs waiting for them afterward? The psychological toll was immense. In American culture, particularly for men, identity was closely tied to work. You were what you did. When you lost your job, you lost not just income but purpose, dignity, self-worth. Men who had been respected members of their communities, skilled workers, small business owners, professionals, found themselves standing in breadlines, accepting charity, unable to provide for their families. The shame was crushing. Marriages strained and broke under the weight. Families dissolved. Fathers abandoned their families, not out of cruelty, but out of a desperate hope that their wives and children might qualify for the meagre relief that might be available if there wasn't an able-bodied man in the household. Let me describe the breadlines, because they became one of the defining images of the Depression. In cities across America, charitable organizations and local governments set up soup kitchens and breadlines. Men, mostly men. Though women and children, too, would line up for hours, sometimes starting before dawn, waiting for a bowl of soup, a piece of bread, maybe some coffee. The food was basic, minimal, enough to keep you alive, but not much more. The lines stretched for blocks. Standing in them was an admission of defeat. But hunger doesn't care about pride. Hoovervilles, shanty towns named bitterly after President Hoover, sprang up in every major city. These were settlements of shacks made from scrap wood, cardboard, tar paper, whatever materials people could scavenge. They appeared in parks, under bridges, on empty lots. The largest was in St. Louis, housing thousands of people. New York Central Park had several. These weren't just homeless people in the modern sense. These were formerly middle-class families living in shacks because they'd lost everything. Children suffered in ways that were particularly heartbreaking. Schools reported increasing numbers of students showing signs of malnutrition. Teachers sometimes spent their own meagre salaries buying food for their students. Milk consumption dropped because families couldn't afford it. Children went barefoot because shoes were too expensive. In rural areas, children wore clothes made from flour sacks because fabric was too costly. The sacks originally said flour on the side, and when manufacturers realized this was happening, they started printing their sacks with patterns so children would at least have clothes that didn't advertise their poverty. Healthcare became a luxury. When you're choosing between food and medicine, food wins. Infant mortality rates, which had been declining through the 1920s, stopped declining. Some diseases that had been under control made comebacks. Dental care was almost entirely foregone. People suffered in silence because seeing a doctor meant paying a doctor, and there was no money for that. There was also, it must be said, a kind of solidarity in suffering. Communities came together in ways they hadn't before. Neighbours shared what little they had. Extended families moved in together, pooling resources. People helped each other because everyone understood. You might be the one helping today, but you might be the one needing help tomorrow. The Depression was, among other things, a reminder that we're all vulnerable, all dependent on systems larger than ourselves, all capable of falling despite our best efforts. Some people tried to escape by riding the rails, Hundreds of thousands of men and some women and children became hobos, travelling the country illegally on freight trains, looking for work, looking for something better somewhere else. They developed their own culture, their own code of symbols marked on fences and walls, indicating which houses might offer food, which towns had hostile police, where you might find temporary work. It was a hard, dangerous life. People fell from trains, froze in winter, starved. But it seemed better than staying in a place where this was nothing. And through all of this, the unemployed were often blamed for their own condition. There was a persistent belief, particularly among those who still had jobs, that unemployment was a personal failing. If you really wanted to work, you'd find work. If you were unemployed, you must be lazy, or inferior, or lacking in initiative. This wasn't just cruelty. It was a psychological defense mechanism. If unemployment was a personal failing, then those who were still employed could believe they were safe because they were better, more deserving, harder working. Admitting that unemployment could happen to anyone was admitting your own vulnerability, and that was too frightening. The reality, of course, was that unemployment was a structural problem, not an individual one. When there are 100 men and 10 jobs, 90 men will be unemployed no matter how hard they try, how much initiative they have, how desperately they want to work. But this truth was hard to accept, because it meant admitting that the system itself was broken and that the solutions needed to be systemic, not individual. As 1931 turned into 1932 and unemployment continued to rise, the question became not just how to survive, but whether the social fabric itself would hold. When people are hungry, when their children are suffering, when they feel abandoned by the institutions that are supposed to protect them, what happens? We'll explore that question as we continue through the story of the Depression, but let it rest in your mind for now. Let yourself sit with the weight of what millions of people were experiencing day after day, month after month, with no end in sight. While cities struggled with unemployment and bank failures, the Great Plains were facing a different catastrophe, one that was both economic and ecological, a man-made disaster overlaid on a natural one. This was the Dust Bowl, and it would become one of the most powerful symbols of Depression-era suffering. The story begins decades earlier, during the great expansion of American agriculture in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The Great Plains, stretching from Texas through Oklahoma, Kansas, Nebraska, and the Dakotas, had traditionally been grazing land. The native grasses had deep root systems that held the soil in place. But as wheat prices rose, particularly during World War I when American grain fed Allied armies, farmers ploughed up millions of acres of grassland to plant wheat. This worked well as long as the rains came. The southern plains have always cycled between wet years and dry years, but when the 1930s began, they entered one of the worst droughts in recorded history. The rains stopped, the wheat died, and the soil, no longer held by those deep prairie grass roots, began to blow away. Imagine, if you can, what a dust storm looks like. Not a gentle wind-blown dirt, but walls of dust thousands of feet high, rolling across the land like tsunamis, turning day into night. These storms, called quote 12, could be seen from 100 miles away. When they hit, the dust penetrated everything, through window cracks, under doors, into lungs. People hung wet sheets over windows, stuffed rags in cracks, and still the dust got in. It covered food, contaminated water, made breathing difficult. Children and elderly people died from, quote 13. The worst day was April 14th, 1935, a date that became known as quote Forsend. That morning dawned clear and beautiful across the plains. Then, in the early afternoon, the temperature suddenly dropped and the sky turned dark as a massive dust storm swept down from the north. Witnesses described it as looking like the end of the world. This was the storm that inspired a reporter to coin the term, quote, 15, and the name stuck. But the dramatic storms were only part of the story. The real devastation was the steady, relentless loss of topsoil. Farmers watched helplessly as their land that had sustained crops for years, land they'd invested everything in, literally blew away. The soil that did remain was depleted, exhausted, unable to support life. Crops failed year after year. Without crops, farmers couldn't earn money. Without money, they couldn't pay mortgages. Banks foreclosed. Families were forced off land they'd worked for generations. This combined with a broader economic depression to create a uniquely desperate situation. Even if a farmer managed to grow a crop, prices were so low that it often cost more to harvest and transport the crop than you could sell it for. There are accounts of farmers burning corn for fuel because it was cheaper than coal. Others let crops rot in the fields because there was no point in harvesting them. The fundamental logic of farming, plant seeds, 10 crops, harvest, sell for profit, had completely broken down. The human toll was staggering. Hundreds of thousands of people left the plains, abandoning farms that their families had worked for decades. They loaded whatever possessions they could fit into old cars or trucks and headed west, particularly to California, where rumor had it there was work in the fields and orchards. These migrants became known as, quote, 16, though they came from many states, not just Oklahoma, and they faced hostility wherever they went. California, already struggling with Depression-era unemployment, didn't want more poor migrants competing for scarce jobs. Signs went up. No Okies. Migrants lived in camps, worked for starvation wages when they could find work at all, and faced discrimination that was bitter and sharp. The writer John Steinbeck captured this migration in The Grapes of Wrath, published in 1939. His fictional Joad family's journey from Oklahoma to California mirrored the real experiences of hundreds of thousands of families. The novel was controversial. Some called it communist propaganda, others found it too grim, but for those who had lived through the migration, it rang painfully true. What made the Dust Bowl particularly tragic was that it was largely preventable. The native prairie had evolved over thousands of years to survive droughts. The deep-rooted grasses held soil in place, retained moisture, and recovered when the rains returned. But in the space of a few decades, American agriculture had destroyed this system. Driven by market incentives, high wheat prices, the mechanization of farming that made it possible to work larger areas, government encouragement to expand production, farmers had created an ecological disaster. The government's initial response was minimal. This was consistent with Herbert Hoover's general approach to the Depression. Government should facilitate private solutions but not intervene directly. But as the crisis deepened, even Hoover authorized some relief measures. When Franklin Roosevelt became president in 1933, the response became more aggressive. The government bought cattle that were starving for lack of feed, paying farmers who were desperate for any income. The New Deal created programs to teach soil conservation, to plant trees as windbreaks, to pay farmers to leave some land fallow to recover. But these solutions took time, years. Through the mid-1930s, the storms continued. The migration continued. The suffering continued. Communities that had been thriving 20 years earlier became ghost towns. abandoned buildings slowly buried by drifting soil. Children grew up knowing only hardship, wondering if life would ever be better, if the rains would ever return. The Dust Bowl was environmental catastrophe, economic disaster, and human tragedy woven together. It demonstrated how fragile prosperity could be, how quickly abundance could turn to desolation. And it showed that sometimes disaster isn't caused by malicious intent, but by countless individual decisions that, combined, create outcomes no one wanted or imagined. Each farmer who ploughed up prairie grass was just trying to make a living, to provide for family, to participate in American prosperity. Collectively, they destroyed the land that sustained them. The rains would eventually return. The land would slowly recover. But the Dust Bowl left scars on the land, on the people who lived through it, on American consciousness. It became a parable about hubris, about the limits of human control over nature, about the price of treating land as nothing more than a resource to be exploited. Those lessons were hard-won and painful. Let them settle in your mind as we continue through the Depression years, through the depths of suffering toward the eventual recovery. Let's talk about Herbert Hoover, because he's often made into a villain in Depression-era narratives, and while he certainly made mistakes, the story is more complicated and more human than simple villainy would suggest. Herbert Hoover was in many ways the perfect embodiment of the American dream. Born into poverty, orphaned at 9, he worked his way through Stanford University, became a successful mining engineer, and made his fortune before he was 40. During World War I, he organized relief efforts that fed millions of starving Belgians, earning international acclaim. He served as Secretary of Commerce through the 1920s, promoting efficiency and voluntary cooperation between government and business. When he was elected president in 1928, in a landslide victory, he seemed ideally suited for the job. The stock market crashed less than 8 months into his presidency. Hoover's fundamental belief was that America's strength lay in voluntary cooperation, in local communities solving their own problems, in private charity supplemented by limited government action. He thought government relief would undermine American character, making people dependent rather than self-reliant. This wasn't mere cruelty or indifference. Hoover genuinely believed he was protecting core American values. He also gave generously from his own pocket to relief organizations and regularly visited areas of particular hardship. But his philosophy prevented him from taking the kind of aggressive federal action that the crisis demanded. Consider his approach to unemployment. Hoover believed that local governments and private charity should handle relief. When these proved inadequate, and they were woefully inadequate, he resisted direct federal relief for the unemployed. He did support some federal programs, public works projects to create jobs, the Reconstruction Finance Corporation to stabilize banks and railroads, measures to support farm prices, but these were indirect. The idea of the federal government directly giving money to unemployed people was, to Hoover, a dangerous step towards socialism that would corrupt American values. The problem was that the Depression was too big for voluntary cooperation and local relief. Private charities ran out of money. Local governments couldn't raise taxes because everyone was broke. Cities and states teetered on the edge of bankruptcy. People were starving, and Hoover's principles prevented him from doing what needed to be done. His public statements grew increasingly disconnected from reality. In March 1930, he predicted that the worst effects of the crash would be over in 60 days. In May, he said, quote, 19. These optimistic proclamations, repeated month after month as conditions grew steadily worse, made him seem either deluded or dishonest. Neither was true. He was trying to maintain confidence. Believing that pessimism itself worsened the depression, but the effect was to make people feel he didn't understand their suffering. The nadir of Hoover's presidency came in the summer of 1932, with what became known as the Bonus Army Incident. After World War I, Congress had promised veterans a bonus payment, but it wasn't due until 1945. As the Depression deepened, about 43,000 veterans and their families marched to Washington, D.C., camping in makeshift shelters near the Capitol, demanding immediate payment of the bonus. They were peaceful, orderly, desperate. Congress debated and ultimately voted down the early payment. Most of the veterans went home, but some, perhaps 10,000, stayed, having nowhere else to go. In July, Hoover ordered the camps cleared. Army troops under the command of General Douglas MacArthur, with tanks and tear gas, forcibly removed the veterans. The camps were burned. The images of US Army troops attacking American veterans shocked the nation. Whether Hoover ordered the excessive force or whether MacArthur exceeded his orders remains debated, but Hoover took the blame. His approval ratings, already low, plummeted further. By the election of 1932, Hoover had become a symbol of the Depression itself. Hooverville meant shantytown. Hoover blanket meant a newspaper used for warmth. Hoover flag meant an empty pocket turned inside out. This was deeply unfair in some ways. The Depression wasn't caused by any one person, and some of Hoover's policies actually laid groundwork for the eventual recovery. But fairness doesn't matter much when you're hungry and homeless. The election of 1932 was a referendum on the Depression and on Hoover's response to it. The Democratic candidate Franklin Delano Roosevelt, governor of New York, campaigned on a promise of a, quote, 23 for the American people. He didn't have a detailed plan. Much of the New Deal would be improvised after he took office, but he radiated confidence and empathy. Where Hoover seemed stiff and out of touch, Roosevelt seemed warm and understanding. Where Hoover defended traditional values, Roosevelt promised bold action and experimentation. Roosevelt won in a landslide, carrying 42 of 48 states. Hoover was devastated. He believed Roosevelt's policies would destroy America, would lead to dictatorship or socialism or both. In the 4 months between the election and Roosevelt's inauguration, inaugurations didn't happen until March back then. The Depression grew worse. Banks were failing at an accelerating rate. Some blamed Hoover for being a lame duck. Others blamed Roosevelt for creating uncertainty about what policies he'd implement. Probably both contributed. Hoover left office in March 1933 a broken man. He lived for another 31 years, but his presidency defined his legacy. In many ways, this is tragic. He was a capable administrator, a generous philanthropist, a man who genuinely cared about helping people. But he was also rigid, unable to adapt his principles to unprecedented circumstances, and unable to communicate empathy effectively. He became president at the worst possible time for his particular temperament and philosophy. The lesson of Hoover's failure isn't that he was a bad man. It's that good intentions and traditional wisdom aren't always enough. Sometimes circumstances demand new approaches, experimentation, a willingness to challenge fundamental assumptions. Hoover couldn't do that. He clung to his beliefs even as they led him and the country into disaster. Whether Roosevelt's different approach would work remained to be seen as he prepared to take office in March 1933. But one thing was clear: the American people were ready for change. They were ready to try something, anything different. They had nothing left to lose. The Great Depression wasn't just an American phenomenon. The crash on Wall Street sent shockwaves through the global economy, and understanding these international dimensions helps us see just how interconnected the world had become by 1929, and how that interconnection could spread disaster as easily as prosperity. Let's start with Europe, because Europe's situation was particularly precarious. World War I had ended only 11 years before the crash. The victorious Allies, Britain, France, Italy, had saddled Germany with crushing war reparations meant as punishment and as compensation for the enormous costs of the war. Germany, its economy already devastated by the conflict, struggled to pay these reparations. The early 1920s saw hyperinflation in Germany so severe that people needed wheelbarrows full of cash to buy bread, and the currency essentially became worthless. By the late 1920s, Germany had stabilized somewhat, largely through American loans. American banks and investors, flush with cash during the boom years, had lent billions to Germany and other European countries. This created a circular flow. Germany borrowed from America to pay reparations to Britain and France, who used that money to pay back war debts to America. As long as American money kept flowing, the system worked, shakily. But the system depended entirely on American prosperity continuing. When the stock market crashed, American loans to Europe dried up. American investors needed their money back. They recalled loans, they stopped making new ones. The circular flow broke down. Germany couldn't pay reparations. Without reparations, France and Britain couldn't pay their war debts. The entire rickety structure of post-war international finance collapsed. Germany was hit especially hard. By 1932, German unemployment reached 30%, even higher than in the United States. The social and political consequences were catastrophic. The Weimar Republic, Germany's democratic government, seemed unable to address the crisis. Political extremism flourished. The Nazi Party, which had been a marginal force in the 1920s, gained increasing support by promising to restore German prosperity and pride. In 1933, Adolf Hitler became Chancellor. The Great Depression didn't solely cause the rise of fascism in Germany, but it created the conditions that made Hitler's message appealing to desperate people. Britain, though not hit as hard as Germany or the United States, still suffered significant economic contraction and unemployment. In 1931, Britain abandoned the gold standard, the policy of backing currency with gold reserves, which had been a cornerstone of the international financial system for decades. This was shocking. Britain had been the centre of global finance for a century. If Britain couldn't maintain the gold standard, what did that say about the stability of the entire system? France held on longer, but was eventually forced off the gold standard too. The abandonment of gold by major economies meant that currencies could be devalued, which helped exports but hurt imports and created instability in international trade. Countries began trying to protect their own industries through tariffs and trade restrictions, which reduced global trade even further. Instead of countries working together to combat the depression, each pursued its own interests, making the situation worse for everyone. Latin America, heavily dependent on exporting raw materials, crops, minerals, oil, to industrialized nations, saw demand for its exports collapse. Prices for commodities fell dramatically. Argentina, Brazil, Chile all faced economic crisis. Some defaulted on international debts. Political instability increased throughout the region. Democracies gave way to dictatorships or military rule as leaders promised strong action to address the crisis. In Asia, Japan's economy was hit hard by falling export demand, particularly for silk. Japan had been rapidly industrializing and modernizing, trying to compete with Western powers. The Depression fed Japanese militarism and expansionism. If Japan couldn't succeed through trade, perhaps it could succeed through conquest. In 1931, Japan invaded Manchuria, seeking raw materials and living space. This was an early sign of the breakdown of international order that would eventually lead to World War II. China, already in political turmoil from a long civil war, faced additional hardship. Prices for agricultural exports fell. Millions of Chinese peasants, already living on the edge of subsistence, were pushed into destitution. This instability would have long-term consequences for China's political development. The Soviet Union presented an interesting case. While capitalist economies were collapsing, the USSR under Stalin was pursuing rapid industrialization through centralized planning. Soviet propaganda made much of this contrast. Capitalism in crisis while socialism built a new world. This wasn't entirely accurate. Stalin's forced industrialization came at enormous human cost, including famine that killed millions in Ukraine. But to outside observers, particularly leftist intellectuals in the West, the Soviet Union seemed to offer an alternative model that was working. The international dimensions of the Depression fed a growing skepticism about capitalism, about democracy, about the liberal international order that had been built after World War I. If the system could produce such catastrophic failure, maybe the system itself was flawed. This skepticism drove people toward extreme alternatives, communism on the left, fascism on the right, that promised to sweep away the failed old order and build something new. There were attempts at international cooperation. The London Economic Conference in 1933 brought together representatives from 66 nations to coordinate responses to the Depression. But the conference collapsed in failure. Countries couldn't agree on basic approaches. National interests trumped international cooperation. President Roosevelt focused on domestic recovery, essentially sabotaged the conference by refusing to commit to currency stabilization that might have constrained his domestic policy options. The failure of international cooperation meant each country pursued its own path to recovery. Some, like the United States under Roosevelt, tried massive government intervention and spending. Others, like Britain, muddled through with more modest reforms, and some, like Germany and Japan, chose militarism and territorial expansion. These different paths would eventually lead to World War II, but in the early to mid-1930s, that outcome wasn't yet clear. Countries were focused on immediate survival, not long-term consequences. The international story of the Depression shows how a crisis that began with stock speculation in New York could cascade through the entire global economy, toppling governments, fostering extremism, and creating conditions for future conflict. It demonstrated that economic systems are deeply interconnected, and that problems in one part of the world can quickly become everyone's problem. This lesson, that we're all in this together, that global problems require global solutions, was learned painfully during the Depression, but it's a lesson that each generation seems to need to relearn. As we move forward from this point, as we look at how the Depression continued to deepen in 1932 and early 1933, keep in mind this global context. The suffering wasn't confined to one country. The search for solutions wasn't happening in isolation. The entire world was grappling with questions about how economies should work, what government should do, what values should guide society. These were years when the basic assumptions of modern life were being challenged and reconsidered, and out of that challenging and reconsidering would eventually come a new world, though the birth would be long and painful. Let's pause here. In the winter of 1932 to 1933, because this was arguably the lowest point of the entire Depression, the moment when things seemed darkest and the future most uncertain. By this point, the Depression had been going on for over 3 years. The initial shock had long since worn off, replaced by a grinding, exhausting struggle for survival that seemed to have no end. The unemployment rate peaked at about 25% in 1933. Industrial production had fallen by nearly half from its 1929 levels. Construction of new housing had virtually ceased. International trade had collapsed by more than 60%. Banks were failing at an accelerating rate. Over 4,000 banks had failed since 1930, wiping out the savings of millions. But statistics, as we've noted before, don't capture the human reality. Let me try to paint a picture of what daily life was like for many Americans during that terrible winter. If you had a job, you lived in constant fear of losing it. You accepted pay cuts without complaint. You worked longer hours for less money. You watched as colleagues were laid off, wondering if you'd be next. The stress was chronic and exhausting. If you didn't have a job, your days were consumed by the search for work and the struggle to survive. You might wake up in a Hooverville shack, cold because you couldn't afford fuel for heating. Or you might wake up in an apartment you were about to be evicted from, or in a relative's overcrowded house where you were wearing out your welcome. You'd spend the day looking for work, checking factory gates, reading want ads, following up on any lead no matter how unlikely. You'd stand in line for bread. You'd visit relief offices, where overwhelmed staff would tell you there was no money, to come back next week, next month. Children during this time absorbed their parents' anxiety. They learned to be quiet about hunger. They wore clothes that didn't fit, shoes with cardboard soles when the leather wore through. They watched their parents argue about money, watched the strain on their faces, and learned too young that the world was a harsh, uncertain place. Marriage rates fell. Young people delayed marriage because they couldn't afford to start a family. Birth rates fell too. Women who were already pregnant sometimes sought dangerous illegal abortions because they couldn't face bringing a child into such a world. These were quiet, private tragedies that didn't make headlines but represented real suffering. There was also, during this period, a kind of numbness. When hardship goes on long enough, when every day is a struggle, people stop being shocked by it. They adapt. They develop coping mechanisms. They find ways to laugh, to find small joys, to continue living even in the worst circumstances. Human beings are remarkably resilient, but that resilience comes at a cost. The generation that lived through the Depression was permanently shaped by it, permanently marked. This was the context in which the presidential transition was taking place. Herbert Hoover had lost the election in November 1932, but Franklin Roosevelt wouldn't take office until March 4, 1933. 4 months of lame duck government during which the crisis deepened. Hoover tried to get Roosevelt to commit to continuing his policies, to not make dramatic changes. Roosevelt refused. He wanted freedom to try new approaches. This uncertainty made the banking crisis worse. Depositors didn't know what to expect, so they withdrew their money, causing more bank failures. In February 1933, the banking system effectively collapsed. Michigan declared a bank holiday, a euphemism for closing all banks to stop the runs. Other states followed. By the time Roosevelt took office in March, banks in 32 states were closed or operating under severe restrictions. The entire financial system was on the verge of complete failure. This was the background to Roosevelt's inauguration on March 4, 1933. The sky was grey. Rain threatened but held off. Roosevelt, confined to a wheelchair by polio, though he went to great lengths to hide this from the public, delivered his inaugural address. And he began with words that would become famous. Quote 24, Fear itself. Roosevelt understood something crucial. The Depression was partly a psychological crisis. Yes, there were real economic problems, unemployment, bank failures, collapsed production. But there was also a failure of confidence, a sense of hopelessness that was itself contributing to the ongoing crisis. People weren't spending money they did have because they were afraid. Banks weren't lending. Businesses weren't investing. Fear was paralyzing the economy. Roosevelt's inaugural address was a direct challenge to that fear. He acknowledged the problems but expressed absolute confidence that they could be solved. He promised, quote 25, quote, he said he would ask Congress for broad executive power to fight the Depression. Power, quote 26, quote the American people, exhausted by Hoover's cautious approach, were ready for bold leadership. They might not have understood exactly what Roosevelt planned to do. He was deliberately vague about specific policies, but they responded to his confidence, his energy, his willingness to try. After years of being told to wait, to be patient, to trust that things would get better on their own, people were ready for a president who promised to actually do something. Roosevelt's first action was to declare a national bank holiday, closing all banks for 4 days to stop the panic and allow time to assess which banks were sound. It was a dramatic move, essentially shutting down the entire banking system, but it worked. The panic stopped. When banks reopened a week later, under new regulations and with government backing for deposits, people didn't rush to withdraw their money. They deposited money instead. Confidence, that fragile, essential quality, began to return. This wasn't the end of the Depression, not even close. The winter of 1932 to 1933 was the nadir, but recovery would take years. Unemployment wouldn't return to pre-Depression levels until World War II mobilization in the early 1940s. But March 1933 marked a turning point psychologically. After 3.5 years of steady decline, of watching things get worse and worse, there was finally a sense that someone was in charge, that action was being taken, that maybe, things could get better. The winter of 1932 to 1933 teaches us something about the nature of crises. At some point, the crisis itself becomes normalized. People adapt, they survive. But this survival comes with costs, psychological, social, moral. And it creates a desperate hunger for change, for hope, for someone to offer a way forward. Roosevelt provided that, whether his specific policies worked or not. Sometimes leadership is less about having the right answers and more about having the courage to act, the ability to inspire confidence, the willingness to try. After years of paralysis, America was finally ready to move. The first 100 days of Franklin Roosevelt's presidency were unlike anything American politics had seen before. Between March and June 1933, Congress passed a flood of legislation, creating new programs, new agencies, new approaches to governing. This was the New Deal, though that term would come to encompass programs enacted over years, not just the initial burst. Let's understand what Roosevelt was attempting. The New Deal wasn't a coherent ideology or a carefully planned blueprint. It was improvisation, experimentation, a willingness to try different approaches and see what worked. Roosevelt famously said, quote 27, "This pragmatism was both a strength and a weakness. It allowed flexibility and rapid response, but it also meant some programs contradicted others, and there was constant confusion about long-term goals. The first priority was the banking crisis. We've mentioned the bank holiday. But Roosevelt did more than just close the banks temporarily. The Emergency Banking Act, passed on March 9th, just 5 days after his inauguration, gave the government power to reorganize and reopen sound banks, and to keep failed banks closed. The act also gave the Federal Reserve the ability to issue more currency, addressing the money supply problem. Equally important was Roosevelt's use of radio to explain his policies directly to the American people. On March 12th, he delivered the first of what would become known as Quote 28, radio addresses in a conversational tone, explaining complex policy in simple language. In this first chat, he explained the banking crisis and the steps being taken to address it. He asked people to trust the banks that reopened, and remarkably, they did. The fireside chats became a powerful tool for maintaining public confidence and support. Next came a cascade of new programs, each addressing a different aspect of the Depression. Let me walk you through some of the most significant. The Civilian Conservation Corps, CCC, was created in March. It employed young men in conservation work, planting trees, building trails, fighting forest fires. By the summer of 1933, over 250,000 young men were living in CCE camps. Earning $1 a day, most of which was sent home to their families, getting 3 meals a day and doing useful work. By the time the program ended in 1942, over 3 million men had participated. It was hugely popular, combining work relief with environmental conservation. The Federal Emergency Relief Administration, VERA, created in May, provided direct relief to states to support the unemployed. This was a significant shift. Federal money, distributed through state and local agencies, to help people buy food and pay rent. It was an acknowledgement that local resources were inadequate, that the federal government had a responsibility to help. The Agricultural Adjustment Act, CAAA, passed in May, tried to raise crop prices by reducing supply. The government would pay farmers to leave some land unplanted, to destroy crops already planted, even to slaughter livestock. This seems economically sensible. Less supply should mean higher prices, but it was psychologically and morally problematic. At a time when people were going hungry, the government was paying farmers to produce less food. The policy was later ruled unconstitutional, but it reflected the complexity of the Depression. Low prices were bankrupting farmers, but raising prices hurt consumers. There were no solutions that helped everyone. The Tennessee Valley Authority, TVA, created in May, was an ambitious regional development program. The Tennessee Valley, covering parts of 7 states, was one of the poorest regions in America. The TVA built dams to control flooding and generate electricity, brought electric power to rural areas, promoted agricultural and industrial development. It was controversial. Critics called it socialism, but it transformed the region. The National Industrial Recovery Act, NIRA, passed in June, was one of the most ambitious and complex New Deal programs. It tried to stabilize industries by creating agreements on prices, wages, working hours, labor rights. The idea was that cutthroat competition had driven down wages and prices, making the Depression worse. So managed cooperation could help. Industries were encouraged to create these codes, with government approval. Workers were guaranteed the right to organize unions and bargain collectively. The NIRA also created the Public Works Administration, PWA, which funded large construction projects, bridges, dams, schools, hospitals. This would employ workers and create useful infrastructure. The PWA would eventually spend billions on tens of thousands of projects, from the Lincoln Tunnel to the Triborough Bridge to hundreds of smaller local projects. These programs, and others, were all created within Roosevelt's first 100 days. The sheer volume of legislation was unprecedented. Roosevelt was keeping his promise to take action. Whether the actions would work was another question, but psychologically the effect was immediate and powerful. People felt that government was engaged, that solutions were being attempted, that they hadn't been abandoned. But the New Deal wasn't without critics. Conservatives argued it gave too much power to the federal government, threatened free enterprise, was moving America towards socialism or even communism. Business leaders, initially supportive, grew increasingly hostile as regulations multiplied. They felt Roosevelt had betrayed his class. He was, after all, from a wealthy family, and was stirring up class warfare. From the left, critics argued the New Deal didn't go far enough. Socialist and communist activists said the capitalist system needed to be replaced entirely, not just reformed. Populist movements emerged like Huey Long's Share Our Wealth program in Louisiana, proposing to radically redistribute wealth through heavy taxes on the rich. Father Charles Coughlin, a radio priest, attracted millions of listeners with broadcasts that mixed economic populism with anti-Semitism and fascist sympathies. Roosevelt navigated between these extremes, trying to reform capitalism enough to save it, to address the legitimate grievances of workers and farmers while preserving basic market mechanisms. It was a delicate balance, and he didn't always get it right. Some New Deal programs failed. Some were struck down by the Supreme Court as unconstitutional. Some were poorly administered or had unintended consequences. The New Deal also had significant blind spots. Many programs either excluded black Americans or administered benefits in ways that perpetuated discrimination. Southern Democrats, whose support Roosevelt needed, ensured that agricultural and domestic workers, categories that included most black workers in the South, were excluded from Social Security and labor protections. Housing programs often reinforced racial segregation through redlining. The New Deal helped millions of Americans, but it helped white Americans more than black Americans, perpetuating racial inequality. Despite these criticisms and limitations, the New Deal marked a fundamental shift in American governance. The idea that the federal government had a responsibility to protect citizens from economic hardship, to provide work relief, to regulate markets, to ensure basic security, these ideas, controversial at the time, became accepted as the proper role of government. The New Deal didn't end the Depression, but it changed what Americans expected from their government and what government was willing to do. As we move forward through the Depression years, we'll see how these programs evolved, how some succeeded and others failed, how the New Deal was constantly being adjusted and expanded. But in 1933, what mattered most was the change in mood. After years of despair, there was hope. After years of being told to wait, there was action. Whether it would be enough remained to be seen. Let's step back from politics and economics for a moment and think about what daily life was actually like for people living through the Depression. Because between the headlines and the policies, people were going about their lives, finding ways to survive, creating meaning and joy even in difficult circumstances. Entertainment, interestingly, thrived during the Depression. This might seem counterintuitive. Wouldn't people have less money for leisure? But entertainment provided escape from harsh reality, and people found ways to afford it. Movie theaters charged 10 cents for admission, sometimes less for children. For a dime, You could sit in a darkened theatre for a few hours and forget your troubles. Hollywood's golden age coincided with the Depression, producing films that range from gritty social realism to lavish musical escapism. Think about the movies of the 1930s. Gangster films like Little Caesar and The Public Enemy featured characters who defied authority and took what they wanted, appealing to audiences feeling powerless. Screwball comedies like It Happened One Night showed unlikely romances across class lines. Musicals like 42nd Street and the Busby Berkeley extravaganzas offered spectacular visual treats, pure escapism. And then there were the Marx Brothers, whose anarchic humour and mockery of authority resonated with Depression audiences. Radio was even more accessible than movies. Once you owned a radio, and by the mid-1930s most families did, entertainment was free. Families gathered in the evening to listen to their favourite programmes. Comedy shows like Amos and Andy, problematic by modern standards but enormously popular then. Dramatic serials, variety shows, news broadcasts, Roosevelt's fireside chats. Radio created a shared national culture. People across the country heard the same programs, laughed at the same jokes, followed the same storylines. Sports provided another form of escape and shared experience. Baseball remained America's pastime. The 1930s saw some of the game's greatest players. Babe Ruth's career was ending, but Lou Gehrig, Joe DiMaggio and others kept fans engaged. Boxing was huge, with matches broadcast on radio. Joe Louis became not just a sports hero but a symbol of hope, particularly for black Americans when he fought and defeated German heavyweight Max Schmeling in 1938. Music evolved during the Depression. The blues, born from African American experience of hardship, captured the mood of the times. But there was also the rise of swing music, big band jazz that was energetic, danceable, optimistic. Benny Goodman, Duke Ellington, Count Basie, these band leaders filled dance halls with young people desperate to forget their troubles for an evening. Dancing was cheap entertainment. Pay a small cover, dance all night. People also created their own entertainment. Card games, board games. This was the era when Monopoly was invented. Ironically, a game about real estate speculation and getting rich, played by people who had lost everything. Families played parlour games, sang around pianos, told stories. Community events, church socials, school programs, local fairs cost little or nothing and provided social connection. Reading offered escape too. Public libraries saw increased usage. Books were free to borrow, and reading killed time while you were looking for work. Pulp magazines with lurid covers offered adventure stories, detective stories, science fiction. Comic books emerged in the late 1930s, with Superman debuting in 1938, a fitting hero for the time, fighting for truth, justice, and the American way. When all three seemed threatened, fashion adapted to hard times. Women's magazines showed how to make dresses from flour sacks. Manufacturers started printing sacks with patterns specifically for this purpose. Hemlines dropped. Longer skirts used more fabric but hid worn shoes and mended stockings. Men's suits were patched and repatched. Clothes were handed down, remade, mended until they literally fell apart. There was no shame in this. Everyone was doing it. Food became both simpler and more creative. Families couldn't afford meat every day, so they ate more beans, potatoes, bread. Cookbooks from the era show inventive recipes designed to stretch meagre ingredients. Casseroles that mix small amounts of meat with lots of cheap starches. Quote 30 sundias made without eggs or butter, which were expensive. Dandelion salad. Dandelions were free. Government agencies distributed recipes and meal plans for balanced nutrition on minimal budgets. Gardening increased. People with any bit of land planted, quote, 38, quote, though they weren't called that until World War II. The practice started in the Depression. Growing your own vegetables saved money and provided fresh food. Cities sometimes allowed vacant lots to be used as community gardens. It was practical, but also psychologically important. You were doing something active, productive, taking control where you could. Family structures changed under Depression pressures. Multiple generations lived together. Adult children moved back with parents. Elderly parents moved in with children. Privacy became rare. Tensions rose. But families also provided crucial support networks. You might not have money, but you could share housing, food, childcare. Marriage was different for the Depression generation. Couples who married during these years often spoke later about how the shared struggle bonded them. They learned to live with less, to value security over romance, to work together to survive. Divorce rates actually fell during the Depression, partly because divorce was expensive, but also perhaps because hard times forced couples to work through difficulties. Children of the Depression, those who grew up during these years, were shaped in distinctive ways. They learned early that the world was uncertain, that security was fragile, that you had to be practical and tough to survive. Many of them later spoke about never feeling completely secure even when they achieved prosperity, always worrying that it could disappear. They tended to save money, avoid debt, be suspicious of risk. The Depression scarred them, but also made them resilient. There was, through all of this hardship, a sense of community that's remarkable. People helped each other. Not everyone, not all the time. There were plenty of stories of selfishness and betrayal. But overall, there was an understanding that everyone was struggling. That we were all in this together. Neighbours shared what they had. Communities organised relief efforts. There was less stigma about accepting help because anyone might need help tomorrow. The Depression changed America's relationship with material goods. Before, during the 1920s boom, there had been an emphasis on consumerism, on buying new things, on keeping up with neighbours. The Depression taught a different lesson. Things could be lost, possessions didn't define worth. Character mattered more than wealth. This sounds noble in the abstract, but it was learned through painful experience, through losing homes, selling treasured possessions, watching everything you'd worked for disappear. As we continue through the Depression years, remember that history isn't just political events and economic statistics. It's millions of individual people living their lives, finding small joys in hard times, making do, surviving. The human capacity for adaptation, for finding meaning and connection even in suffering, is one of the remarkable things the Depression reveals. People didn't just endure, they lived, loved, laughed, hoped. That resilience, that refusal to be defeated, is as much a part of the Depression story as the breadlines and bank failures. The Great Depression produced an extraordinary outpouring of art and literature, much of it directly engaging with the economic crisis and social upheaval. Let's explore how artists and writers of the 1930s captured, interpreted, and tried to make sense of what was happening around them. Photography became a powerful documentary tool during the Depression, particularly through the Farm Security Administration's historical section. The FSA hired photographers, including Dorothea Lange, Walker Evans, Arthur Rothstein and others, to document rural poverty and the effects of Depression-era programs. The goal was partly propaganda, showing the need for government intervention, but the photographers produced work that transcended politics. Consider Dorothea Lange's Migrant Mother. Probably the most famous photograph of the Depression. It shows Florence Owens Thompson, a 32-year-old mother of 7 in a migrant camp in California. Her face is worn, worried, aged beyond her years. 2 of her children lean against her shoulders, their faces turned away. The image captures both specific individual suffering and universal human dignity in the face of hardship. It's become an icon, representing the Depression in a single frame. Walker Evans photographed Alabama sharecropper families with stark, unblinking honesty. His images show poverty without sentimentality, crude wooden shacks, bare rooms, people in worn clothes looking directly at the camera. There's a dignity in his subjects, but also an undeniable harshness. These photographs forced middle-class Americans to confront rural poverty they might have preferred to ignore. The FSA photographs are remarkable for what they reveal about how Americans lived, but also for how they shaped public perception. These images appeared in newspapers and magazines, creating a visual record of the Depression that influenced how people understood their own time and how future generations would remember it. Literature of the 1930s often had explicitly social and political themes. John Steinbeck's quote, Rand 40 Kjand, published in 1939, told the story of the Joad family's migration from Oklahoma to California. It's filled with anger at injustice, at the economic system that destroyed small farmers and exploited migrant workers. But it's also a story of family bonds, of human resilience, of solidarity among the dispossessed. The novel was controversial, banned in some places, burned by others, but it won the Pulitzer Prize and became one of the defining works of American literature. Steinbeck's earlier novel, just quote, 41, 1937, was set among migrant ranch workers in California. It's a simpler story than Grapes of Wrath, but equally powerful, exploring friendship, loneliness, and the American dream, or the death of that dream. The 2 main characters, George and Lenny, dream of owning their own small farm, being independent. It's a dream that seems almost within reach, but ultimately proves impossible. That theme, dreams deferred or destroyed, runs through much Depression-era literature. James Agee and Walker Evans collaborated on quote 43 quote 1941, combining Agee's prose with Evans's photographs to document the lives of 3 Alabama sharecropper families. Agee's writing is dense, experimental, angry at poverty and at his own role as an observer. He struggled with the ethics of documenting other people's suffering, of potentially exploiting them. The book wasn't commercially successful when published, but it's now recognized as a masterpiece of documentary literature. Richard Wright's Native Son, 1940, used the framework of a crime novel to explore racism and poverty in Chicago. The protagonist, Bigger Thomas, is a young black man trapped by poverty and discrimination. When he accidentally kills a white woman, his fate is sealed, not by justice but by a racist system. Wright wasn't writing about the Depression specifically, but about the conditions that the Depression intensified for black Americans. Not all Depression-era literature was grim social realism. Some writers offered escape. Margaret Mitchell's Gone with the Wind, 1936, was set during and after the Civil War, but its themes of survival after catastrophic loss resonated with Depression audiences. The protagonist, Scarlett O'Hara, faces repeated disasters and keeps reinventing herself, refusing to give up. That resilience appealed to readers living through their own hard times. Hard-boiled detective fiction emerged in the 1930s, with writers like Dashiell Hammett and Raymond Chandler. Their detectives operated in corrupt urban worlds, where wealth and power protected criminals while ordinary people suffered. These weren't cozy mysteries, but noir stories about moral ambiguity in a harsh world. The style matched the times, cynical but ultimately maintaining a code of honor, refusing to be completely corrupted. The Federal Writers Project, part of the Works Progress Administration WPA, employed thousands of writers during the Depression. Some worked on state guidebooks, detailed descriptions of every state's history, geography, culture. Others collected oral histories, including invaluable interviews with formerly enslaved people, preserving memories that might otherwise have been lost. Young writers who got their start in the FWP included Ralph Ellison, Saul Bellow, John Cheever, Richard Wright. It was a remarkable incubator of literary talent. Theatre thrived in the 1930s, partly through the Federal Theatre Project, another WPA program. It staged everything from Shakespeare to contemporary social dramas to experimental works. Some productions had explicit political messages. It Can't Happen Here dramatized Sinclair Lewis's novel about fascism coming to America. Others were pure entertainment. The FTP brought theatre to communities that had never had professional theatre before, employed thousands of actors and workers, and made theatre accessible to millions. Visual arts received government support through the Federal Art Project, which commissioned murals for post offices and other public buildings. These murals often depicted American history, workers and farmers, regional landscapes, a celebration of American identity and labor. Diego Rivera, the Mexican muralist, was controversial for including socialist themes in his work. Others stuck to safer, more patriotic imagery. But the very idea of government supporting art, of artists on public payroll, was radical. Music in the 1930s ranged from Woody Guthrie's folk songs about workers and migrants. This Land Is Your Land was written in 1940, partly as a response to Irving Berlin's Quote for We Us, which Guthrie thought too complacent, to Aaron Copland's orchestral works like Billy the Kid and Appalachian Spring, which drew on American folk themes. Classical composers integrated American vernacular music, creating a distinctive American sound. The arts during the Depression served multiple functions. They documented suffering and injustice, giving voice to people who normally weren't heard. They provided escape and entertainment when people desperately needed it. They employed thousands of artists who might otherwise have been destitute. And they created a cultural legacy, books, photographs, murals, music, that continues to shape how we understand that period and who we are as Americans. There's something powerful about a society in crisis still investing in art and culture. The New Deal arts programs were controversial. Critics saw them as wasteful spending when people needed jobs and food. But Roosevelt and others understood that culture matters, that art is part of what makes life worth living, that a society is more than just its economy. The decision to support artists during the Depression was a statement about values, about what kind of society America wanted to be. And the art produced during those years remains, bearing witness, telling stories, preserving memory. Long after the economic statistics are forgotten, Dorothea Lange's photographs and John Steinbeck's novels and Woody Guthrie's songs continue to speak to us about the Depression, about America, about the human experience of living through hard times with dignity and hope. By the mid-1930s, there were signs that the worst of the Depression was over. Let's be careful how we understand this. The Depression wasn't over. Unemployment remained high. Poverty was still widespread. But the absolute nadir of 1932 to 1933 had passed. Things were, slowly and unevenly, getting better. The banking system stabilized after the 1933 crisis. the creation of the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation (FDIC), which guaranteed bank deposits up to a certain amount, restored confidence. People stopped pulling their money out because they knew that even if a bank failed, their deposits were protected. This simple reform, criticized by some bankers as unnecessary government interference, effectively ended the bank runs that had devastated the financial system. Industrial production began to recover. The trough had been in March 1933, the same month Roosevelt took office. By late 1933, production was rising. By 1935, it was approaching 1929 levels, though it would take until World War II for it to fully recover and exceed the previous peak. Factories that had been shuttered reopened. Assembly lines started moving again. The volume of goods being produced increased steadily. Unemployment, which had peaked at about 25% in 1933, began a slow decline. By 1935, it was around 20%, still terrible, but moving in the right direction. By 1937, it had dropped to about 14%. These numbers meant millions of people found jobs, were able to support their families, regain dignity and purpose. Each percentage point drop represented hundreds of thousands of individual human victories over depression. Farm prices stabilized and even rose slightly, helped by New Deal programs and by severe droughts that reduced supply, though this was cold comfort to farmers in the Dust Bowl. The combination of reducing production through the AA programs and natural weather patterns reducing supply worked perversely to raise prices. Farmers who'd been facing bankruptcy found they could pay their debts. Farm foreclosures decreased. Construction, which had virtually ceased in the early 1930s, began to revive. Not private construction so much. People still couldn't afford to build new houses or office buildings, but public construction through programs like the PWA and the WPA. Bridges, dams, schools, post offices, roads. These projects employed millions of workers and created infrastructure that would serve America for generations. The stock market, that barometer of economic confidence, recovered substantially. From its low of 41 in July 1932, the Dow Jones Industrial Average rose to 194 by March 1937. Not back to the 1929 peak of 381, but a substantial recovery. This wasn't just about speculators making money. Stock market recovery meant pension funds were more secure. Corporations could raise capital. The entire financial system was healthier. Consumer confidence was returning. People were spending more, buying cars, purchasing appliances, going to movies and restaurants. This spending was crucial. In an economy, one person's spending is another person's income. When spending increases, businesses hire more workers, who then spend their wages, creating a positive cycle. The negative spiral that had characterized 1929 to 1933 was beginning to reverse. Culturally, there was a shift in mood. The desperate, frightened atmosphere of the early Depression was lifting. People still faced hardship, still struggled, but there was a sense that the worst was over, that survival was possible, that maybe, there was a future to look forward to. This psychological change, hard to quantify but real, mattered enormously. However, and this is important, the recovery was fragile and incomplete. Large numbers of Americans remained unemployed. Poverty was still widespread. Many of the jobs created by New Deal programs were temporary, not permanent employment. Agricultural workers and domestic workers, a large proportion of the workforce, remained excluded from labour protections and social security. The benefits of recovery were distributed unevenly, and in 1937, disaster struck again. Roosevelt, as encouraged by the apparent recovery and worried about budget deficits, decided to reduce government spending. The Federal Reserve, concerned about inflation, tightened monetary policy. These combined actions pulled support from an economy that wasn't yet strong enough to stand on its own. The result was the Roosevelt recession of 1937 to 1938. The stock market crashed again, though not as severely as in 1929. Unemployment, which had been decreasing, jumped back up. Industrial production fell sharply. All the progress of 1933 to 1937 seemed threatened. The recession was short. By 1938, recovery was underway again. But it was a stark reminder that the Depression hadn't been truly vanquished. The 1937 to 1938 recession sparked fierce debate about New Deal policies. Critics argued it proved that government intervention was hindering recovery, that the New Deal needed to be scaled back to let the free market work. Supporters argued the opposite, that the recession proved the economy still needed government support, that cutting spending had been a mistake. This debate would continue for decades and in some forms continues today. What the 1937 to 1938 recession really showed was that recovery from a depression is not a straight line. There are setbacks. The damage done by the initial collapse is deep and takes years to truly heal. Confidence is fragile. The temptation to declare victory prematurely, to pull back support too soon, can undo progress. Patience and sustained effort are required. By 1939, as we'll discuss shortly, the shadow of World War II was falling across the world. That war would finally, definitively end the Depression, though not through any peaceful means. The massive government spending required to fight the war, spending that dwarfed anything the New Deal had done, would create full employment and economic boom. But that's getting ahead of our story. In the mid to late 1930s, Americans were rebuilding, slowly, with setbacks, unevenly, but rebuilding. Families who had been broken apart came back together. Men who had been unemployed for years found jobs. Farms that had been on the edge of foreclosure survived. It wasn't prosperity, not yet, but it was survival, and survival was no small thing. The Depression had taught harsh lessons about the fragility of economic systems, about how quickly security can vanish, about the need for collective action to address collective problems. These lessons were being learned painfully through lived experience. And though the Depression wasn't over, its worst effects were beginning to fade, like a long night slowly giving way to dawn. One of the most enduring legacies of the Great Depression is the Social Security system, created in 1935 as part of Roosevelt's New Deal. To understand its significance, we need to consider what life was like for elderly Americans before Social Security existed. In the early 20th century, old age was often synonymous with poverty. People worked as long as they physically could, and when they could no longer work, they depended on their children, or if they had no children or their children couldn't help, on charity or poorhouses. The idea of retirement as a time of leisure, of having enough money saved to support yourself in old age, was a privilege of the wealthy. For most people, you worked until you died, or until your body gave out, at which point you hoped someone would take care of you. The Depression made this situation catastrophic. Elderly people who had managed to save some money saw their savings wiped out in bank failures. Those who depended on their children found their children unemployed and unable to help. Poor houses were overwhelmed. Elderly poverty was everywhere visible. Old people begging, living in desperate conditions, dying in neglect. Several social movements emerged proposing solutions. Dr. Francis Townsend, a California physician, proposed that the government should pay every citizen over 60 a pension of $200 per month, with the requirement that they spend it all within the month. The idea was to provide for the elderly while also stimulating the economy through their spending. The Townsend plan attracted millions of supporters, particularly elderly Americans who saw it as their salvation. It was economically impractical. The cost would have been enormous, but it demonstrated massive public support for old age pensions. Roosevelt and his advisors understood they needed to respond to this pressure, but they wanted a system that was sustainable, that would be politically difficult to dismantle later, that would be seen as earned rather than as charity. The solution was Social Security, signed into law in August 1935. The Social Security Act created several programs, but the most important was the Old Age Insurance Program, what we typically mean when we say, quote, 52, quote, workers, and their employers would pay taxes into the system. When workers reach retirement age, initially 65, they would receive monthly benefits. The amount you received would be based on how much you'd paid in. Higher earners would get larger benefits, though the formula was progressive, giving relatively more to lower earners. This structure was politically brilliant. Because workers paid into the system, they felt entitled to benefits. It was their money coming back to them, not a handout. This made Social Security very difficult to attack politically. It wasn't welfare, it was insurance you had paid for. Roosevelt explicitly designed it this way. We put those payroll contributions there so as to give the contributors a legal, moral, and political right to collect their pensions. With these taxes in there, no damn politician can ever scrap my Social Security program. The Social Security Act also created unemployment insurance, aid to dependent children, what would later become welfare, and assistance to the elderly poor who hadn't worked enough to qualify for Social Security. These were administered by states with federal support and the specifics varied, but the principle was established. The federal government had responsibility for protecting citizens from certain economic risks. Social Security was limited in crucial ways. Agricultural workers and domestic workers, categories that included most black workers in the South and many women, were excluded. This wasn't accidental. Southern Democrats, whose votes Roosevelt needed to pass the legislation, insisted on these exclusions to maintain the racial and economic power structures of the South. The exclusions would persist for years, meaning Social Security's benefits were distributed unequally along racial lines. Despite these limitations, Social Security represented a fundamental shift in the relationship between government and citizens. It established the principle that society has collective responsibility for ensuring that people can live with basic dignity in old age, that economic security shouldn't depend entirely on individual savings or family support. This was revolutionary in American context, where individualism and self-reliance had been central values. The immediate impact was limited. The first benefits weren't paid until 1940, and initially they were small. But over time, Social Security would grow to become one of the most important and popular government programs. By the 21st century, it would lift millions of elderly Americans out of poverty, providing a foundation of economic security that previous generations couldn't have imagined. Other industrialized nations had already created similar systems. Germany had old age pensions since the 1880s, Britain since 1908. The United States was actually late to this approach. but the Depression created the political will to act, to break with American traditions of limited government and create a safety net. The broader significance is about how societies respond to crisis. The Depression revealed that individuals, no matter how hard-working or prudent, could be overwhelmed by economic forces beyond their control. It showed that family and private charity, while important, weren't adequate to address systemic problems. It demonstrated the need for collective action, for institutions that could provide security that individuals couldn't provide for themselves. This insight extended beyond social security. The New Deal created or strengthened multiple institutions designed to stabilize the economy and protect citizens: bank deposit insurance, securities regulation, labor rights protections, minimum wage laws, public housing programs. Each represented a recognition that laissez-faire capitalism, left entirely to its own devices, could produce outcomes that were socially intolerable. These programs were controversial when created and remain debated today. Questions about the proper size of government, about individual versus collective responsibility, about the economic effects of regulation and social spending, these aren't settled. Different societies answer them differently, and the answers change over time. But the Depression established that these questions must be asked. That societies have choices about how to organize their economies and protect their citizens. As we move through the later years of the Depression toward World War II and its aftermath, the institutions created in the 1930s would prove crucial to post-war prosperity. This safety net, however imperfect and incomplete, provided a foundation. The regulatory framework helped stabilize financial markets. The recognition that government could and should act to moderate economic cycles became accepted wisdom. The Depression had been a disaster, but it also created the framework for a more stable, more secure economic system. That framework would be tested and modified and debated, but it would endure. The Great Depression transformed the American labor movement and the relationship between workers, employers, and government. This transformation was neither smooth nor inevitable, but it represented one of the Depression's most significant social changes. Before the Depression, unions in America were relatively weak, outside of a few industries like coal mining and skilled trades. Most industrial workers weren't unionized. Companies fiercely resisted unions, seeing them as threats to management prerogatives and business efficiency. When workers tried to organize, companies often responded with force, hiring private security, using strike breakers, sometimes working with local police to intimidate or arrest union organizers. Violence against striking workers wasn't uncommon. The Depression changed the balance of power. With unemployment so high, workers had little individual leverage. If you complained about conditions or wages, you could easily be replaced. But this vulnerability also created solidarity. Workers realized that only by acting collectively could they improve their situations. The desperation of the Depression made many workers willing to take risks they wouldn't have taken in better times. Section 7A of the National Industrial Recovery Act, 1933, guaranteed workers, quote, 54, quote. This was a crucial change. For the first time, federal law explicitly protected workers' rights to unionize. When the Supreme Court struck down the NIRA in 1935, Congress passed the National Labor Relations Act, Wagner Act, which restored and strengthened these protections. The Wagner Act created the National Labor Relations Board to enforce labor rights and mediate disputes. These legal changes emboldened workers and unions. Union membership, which had declined in the 1920s and early Depression, began to grow. The American Federation of Labor The main labour federation was dominated by craft unions, skilled workers in specific trades. But there was pressure to organise industrial workers, the mass of semi-skilled and unskilled workers in factories. This led to the creation of the Congress of Industrial Organisations, CIO, in 1935, splitting from the AFL. The CIO focused on organising entire industries rather than specific crafts, all auto workers, all steel workers, regardless of their specific jobs. This industrial unionism was more militant, more willing to confront employers, and more inclusive, accepting black workers and immigrants who were often excluded from AFL craft unions. The late 1930s saw major labour confrontations. In 1936 to 1937, auto workers at General Motors plants in Flint, Michigan pioneered the sit-down strike. Instead of walking out, they stayed inside the factories, occupying the plant so they couldn't be operated with strike breakers. The strike lasted 44 days. GM initially tried to force the workers out, but Michigan's governor, under pressure from the Roosevelt administration, refused to use force. Eventually, GM negotiated and recognized the United Auto Workers, UAW, as the bargaining representative. The sit-down strike was brilliant tactically. Traditional strikes could be broken with strike breakers and police violence against picket lines. But sit-down strikes turned the factory into contested territory. Using force to evict workers risked damaging expensive equipment. The tactic spread rapidly. There were nearly 500 sit-down strikes in 1937 across various industries. The steel industry was another major battleground. US Steel, the largest company, surprised everyone by voluntarily recognizing the Steel Workers Organizing Committee in 1937, perhaps hoping to avoid confrontation. But smaller steel companies, called Little Steel, refused. A strike against Republic Steel led to the Memorial Day Massacre in 1937, when Chicago police fired on strikers and their families during a peaceful march, killing 10 people. The violence shocked the nation and turned public opinion toward the strikers. These struggles were about more than wages. They were about dignity, about workers having a voice in their working conditions, about being treated as human beings rather than interchangeable parts. Many workers had experienced speed-ups, being forced to work faster for the same pay, and arbitrary discipline. Unions fought for grievance procedures, seniority systems, defined work rules. These might seem bureaucratic, but they represented protection against arbitrary management power. The growth of unions changed American politics. Unions became a major force in the Democratic Party, providing money, volunteers, and votes. This Labour-Liberal coalition would dominate Democratic politics for decades. It also created tensions. Southern Democrats remained hostile to unions, fearing they would empower black workers and challenge the racial hierarchy of the South. Union growth faced significant opposition. Many employers never accepted unions as legitimate. They hired lawyers to find loopholes in labour law, hired consultants to run anti-union campaigns, lobbied for changes in legislation. Southern states passed right to work laws making it harder for unions to require membership. The struggle between labour and management would continue for decades, with advances and retreats on both sides. The racial dynamics of the labour movement were complex. The CIO was more racially inclusive than the AFL, but still imperfect. Some unions fought for racial equality, seeing solidarity across racial lines as essential to worker power. Others practiced discrimination, or, at best, tolerated segregated locals. The potential for interracial working-class solidarity was real. black and white workers shared many interests and grievances, but racism was a powerful force that employers could exploit to divide workers. Women's participation in unions was complicated too. Some unions were supportive, but many were dominated by men who saw women workers as temporary or secondary. Women were often paid less than men for the same work, and unions sometimes fought to maintain gender-based wage differentials rather than equal pay. Women workers organised their own struggles, sometimes within existing unions, sometimes creating separate organisations. The Depression-era growth of unions had lasting effects. By 1945, about 35% of non-agricultural workers were union members, up from less than 10% in 1930. This unionisation contributed to the rising wages and shrinking inequality of the post-war decades. Unions pushed for benefits like health insurance and pensions that became standard. They advocated for broader social programs like Social Security and unemployment insurance that helped all workers. But the union movement also faced inherent limitations. Unions were strongest in manufacturing, mining, and construction, sectors that would decline in the late 20th century. Service sector workers, who had become the majority of the workforce, were harder to organise. Union success depended on legal protections that could be weakened or eliminated, and unions themselves could become bureaucratic, losing connection to their members. Even corrupt. The Depression years saw the labour movement transform from a marginal force to a central institution in American life. This happened through struggle, through workers taking risks, through violence and sacrifice. The changes weren't inevitable. They required courage and organisation and timing. But once achieved, they shifted the balance of economic power, giving workers a voice they hadn't had before. That voice would never be as loud as capital's voice, but it was louder than it had been, and that mattered. The workers who struck and organised and fought during the Depression years weren't just improving their own conditions. They were shaping the kind of society America would become. As we consider the Depression's legacy, we need to confront an uncomfortable truth. While the crisis affected everyone, it didn't affect everyone equally. The Depression exacerbated existing inequalities and created new ones, and the New Deal's reforms, while helping millions, often reinforced discriminatory structures rather than challenging them. Let's start with racial inequality, particularly the experience of Black Americans. Black workers were usually the first fired and last hired. The phrase, "Session, quote 58 days," became a bitter motto. In 1932, Black unemployment was estimated at around 50%, double the already catastrophic national rate. In cities where Black and white workers competed for jobs, racial tensions intensified. Some white workers demanded that Black workers be fired to make room for whites. The New Deal programs, despite Roosevelt's sympathy for civil rights, were administered in ways that perpetuated discrimination. The Civilian Conservation Corps maintained segregated camps. The Tennessee Valley Authority built model towns that excluded Black residents. Federal housing programs used discriminatory lending practices and supported racial covenants that prevented Black families from buying homes in white neighborhoods. This redlining would have effects lasting decades, creating patterns of residential segregation and wealth inequality that persist today. Agricultural programs were particularly problematic. The Agricultural Adjustment Act paid landowners to reduce production, but many landowners pocketed the payments rather than sharing them with sharecroppers and tenant farmers. When mechanization allowed large landowners to farm with fewer workers, they evicted sharecroppers, many of them Black, who had nowhere to go. The New Deal agricultural programs accelerated the displacement of black farmers from southern land. Social Security initially excluded agricultural and domestic workers, categories that encompassed most black workers in the South. This wasn't accidental. Southern Democratic congressmen demanded these exclusions as the price of their support. They feared that economic independence for black workers would challenge the racial hierarchy of the Jim Crow South. Roosevelt, needing Southern votes to pass New Deal legislation, accepted these compromises. Women faced different but equally real discrimination. The idea that men should be breadwinners was so ingrained that many believed married women shouldn't work if their husbands had jobs. Some states and localities passed laws prohibiting the hiring of married women in government jobs. The federal government had regulations discouraging the employment of married women. These rules assumed that men naturally deserved jobs more than women, that women worked for pin money rather than family survival. The reality was that many families desperately needed women's income. Single women, widows, women whose husbands were unemployed or disabled, they had to work to survive. And even married women often worked because one income wasn't enough. But they faced discrimination in hiring, lower wages for the same work, and social disapproval. The New Deal programs reflected these attitudes. The CCC was for young men only. Public works programs overwhelmingly hired men. Women did benefit from some programs. About 15% of WPA workers were women. But these jobs were typically in sewing rooms or school lunch programs, reinforcing traditional gender roles. Professional women faced particular barriers. Female doctors, lawyers, and academics found opportunities scarce. Class inequality persisted throughout the Depression. The wealthy suffered losses in the stock market crash, but they rarely faced the grinding poverty that devastated working-class families. They had assets to fall back on, social connections that opened doors, access to credit. The Depression made America's class divisions more visible and more bitter. The sight of wealthy people seemingly untouched by suffering while others starved created resentment and political radicalization. Geographic inequality was significant too. Rural areas, particularly the South and the Great Plains, suffered more than cities in many ways. They had less access to relief programs, fewer job opportunities, worse infrastructure. The Dust Bowl demonstrated how environmental disaster could compound economic crisis. Appalachia, the Deep South, the rural Midwest, these regions experienced poverty that made urban breadlines look almost comfortable. Native Americans faced their own particular hardships. Reservation economies, already marginal, collapsed entirely. Traditional hunting and fishing were insufficient. Federal Indian policy had long been aimed at assimilation, breaking up tribal lands and undermining traditional cultures. The Depression worsened conditions on reservations. John Collier, appointed Commissioner of Indian Affairs in 1933, tried to reverse some destructive policies through the Indian Reorganization Act, but the damage of previous decades was deep. Immigrants and their children faced discrimination and scapegoating. Mexican Americans were targeted for deportation. Perhaps 1 million people, many of them American citizens, were forcibly removed to Mexico during the 1930s in campaigns to reduce competition for jobs. Filipino, Chinese, and Japanese Americans faced racism and employment discrimination. European immigrants weren't immune either. Ethnic prejudices against Italians, Poles, Irish, and others persisted. These inequalities weren't bugs in the system, they were features. The New Deal, for all its achievements, fundamentally accepted existing social hierarchies. It helped millions of people, yes. But it helped white men most. It challenged economic inequality. but largely accepted racial and gender inequality. This was partly political pragmatism. Roosevelt needed Southern and conservative support, but it was also about the limits of imagination and moral vision in that era. The persistence of inequality during the Depression reminds us that crisis doesn't automatically produce justice or solidarity. It can, and often does, intensify divisions and scapegoating. Those with less power suffer more and recover more slowly. And reforms, even well-intentioned ones, can reproduce the inequalities they claim to address if they don't actively challenge discriminatory structures. As the 1930s drew toward their close, events in Europe and Asia cast increasingly dark shadows. The Depression had helped create political instability that was pushing the world toward another catastrophic war, and that war would ultimately end the Depression in ways that the New Deal never quite managed. In Germany, the Nazi Party's rise to power was directly connected to the economic crisis. Hitler became Chancellor in January 1933, the same year Roosevelt became president. The Weimar Republic, Germany's democratic government, had failed to effectively address the Depression. Unemployment, poverty, and political chaos created conditions where Hitler's promises of national revival and scapegoating of Jews and other minorities found receptive audiences. By 1934, Hitler had consolidated dictatorial power. By 1936, he was rearming Germany in violation of the Treaty of Versailles. Italy under Mussolini had already turned to fascism in the 1920s, but the Depression strengthened authoritarian tendencies there too. In 1935, Italy invaded Ethiopia, one of the few independent African nations. The League of Nations, the international organization created after World War I to prevent future wars, proved powerless to stop aggression. In Spain, civil war erupted in 1936 when military officers led by Francisco Franco rebelled against the democratically elected Republican government. Germany and Italy supported Franco's nationalist forces. The Soviet Union supported the Republicans. The Spanish Civil War became a proxy conflict between fascism and communism, and a testing ground for the weapons and tactics that would be used in the coming World War. Japan had invaded Manchuria in 1931 and withdrawn from the League of Nations in 1933. In 1937, Japan launched a full-scale invasion of China. The war was brutal. The rape of Nanking in December 1937 saw Japanese forces massacre hundreds of thousands of Chinese civilians. Japan was pursuing an empire in East Asia, claiming it needed resources and living space that its home islands couldn't provide. The United States watched these developments with growing concern but remained officially neutral. Isolationist sentiment was strong in America. The country had sent soldiers to fight in World War I, had lost thousands of men, and many Americans felt this had been a mistake. The Neutrality Acts of the mid-1930s prohibited arms sales to belligerent nations and restricted American involvement in foreign conflicts. America would not be dragged into another European war, or so many believed. But events made neutrality increasingly difficult to maintain. In September 1939, Germany invaded Poland. Britain and France, which had guaranteed Polish independence, declared war on Germany. World War II in Europe had begun. In 1940, Germany conquered France in a stunning 6-week campaign. Britain stood alone against Nazi Germany, enduring the Blitz, sustained bombing of British cities. Roosevelt understood the threat posed by Nazi Germany and increasingly manoeuvred to support Britain without formally entering the war. The Lend-Lease Act of 1941 allowed America to supply Britain with weapons and supplies. Roosevelt called America the arsenal of democracy, but direct American military involvement still seemed unlikely, until December 7, 1941, when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. The attack killed over 2,400 Americans and damaged or destroyed much of the Pacific Fleet. The next day, Congress declared war on Japan. Germany and Italy, allied with Japan through the Tripartite Pact, declared war on the United States. America was now fully engaged in a two-theatre global war. The immediate effect on the American economy was dramatic. Unemployment, which had still been around 15% in 1940, essentially disappeared. Factories that had been running below capacity suddenly operated around the clock, producing weapons, ships, aircraft, vehicles. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers, taking jobs in factories and offices vacated by men who joined the military. Rosie the Riveter became an iconic figure representing women's wartime industrial work. Government spending, which had seemed large during the New Deal, exploded. The federal budget in 1940 was about $9 billion. By 1945, it was over $92 billion, more than 10 times larger. This spending was financed partly through taxes but mostly through borrowing. The national debt, which had concerned deficit hawks during the New Deal, grew to levels that would have been unthinkable a decade earlier. But the spending worked. It created full employment and economic boom. The war validated, in a strange way, the Keynesian economic theories that had influenced some New Deal policies. John Maynard Keynes had argued that during a depression, government should spend heavily to stimulate demand, even if it meant deficit spending. This was controversial during the New Deal, and Roosevelt himself was sometimes ambivalent about deficits. But the war required massive spending regardless of deficit concerns. And it demonstrated that government spending could indeed lift an economy out of depression. There's a bitter irony here. The depression, which had caused so much suffering, couldn't be ended by peaceful government programs designed to help people. But it could be ended by military spending designed to fight a war. This raised questions. If government could spend whatever was necessary to fight a war, why couldn't it spend whatever was necessary to eliminate poverty and unemployment? The answer wasn't economic. The capacity clearly existed. The answer was political and ideological. War spending was accepted in ways that welfare spending never was. The war years also continued and accelerated social changes that had begun during the Depression. African Americans served in the military, though in segregated units. The experience of fighting for democracy abroad while facing discrimination at home would contribute to the civil rights movement after the war. Women's entry into the workforce during the war would permanently change expectations about women's roles. The GI Bill after the war would provide education and housing benefits that would help create a prosperous middle class, though these benefits were distributed unequally along racial lines. By 1945, when the war ended, America was transformed. The Depression was definitively over. The country was the world's dominant economic and military power. The suffering of the 1930s seemed like a distant memory, though those who lived through it would never forget. The war had been catastrophic. Over 400,000 American deaths, tens of millions of deaths worldwide. But it had accomplished what the New Deal couldn't: full employment, rising wages, renewed confidence. The world that emerged from the war would be shaped by both the Depression and the war, by the institutions created in the 1930s and the power relations established in the 1940s. As we approach the end of our journey through the Great Depression, let's reflect on what it taught and what it left behind. Because the Depression's effects extended far beyond the 1930s, shaping American life and thought for generations. The most immediate lesson was about the fragility of prosperity. The 1920s had seemed to prove that America had entered a new era of permanent abundance. Technology, mass production, modern finance, these had supposedly solved the old problems of scarcity and economic cycles. The crash and depression shattered this confidence. People learned that economic security could vanish almost overnight, that no amount of hard work guaranteed safety, that forces beyond individual control could destroy lives. This lesson created lasting psychological effects. The generation that lived through the Depression carried its mark forever. They saved compulsively, avoided debt, distrusted banks even after reforms made them safer. They wasted nothing, repaired rather than replaced, remembered hunger even in times of plenty. Their children and grandchildren sometimes found these habits excessive or irrational, but they made perfect sense to people who had experienced the Depression. The Depression also taught political lessons. It demonstrated that laissez-faire capitalism, left entirely unregulated, could produce socially intolerable outcomes. The idea that markets always self-correct, that government intervention only makes things worse, that individual responsibility is sufficient to ensure decent outcomes, these ideas were tested and found wanting. This didn't mean capitalism was abandoned, but it meant capitalism would be regulated, managed, supplemented by social programs. The institutions created during the New Deal, Social Security, unemployment insurance, bank deposit insurance, securities regulation, labor rights protections, became permanent features of American life. They were modified over time, sometimes strengthened, sometimes weakened, but the basic framework endured. The idea that government has responsibility for economic stability and citizen welfare, controversial in the 1930s, became accepted wisdom. The Depression taught Keynesian economics to policymakers. The idea that government can and should use fiscal and monetary policy to moderate economic cycles, stimulating the economy during recessions and dampening it during booms, became orthodox. This was a dramatic shift from pre-Depression economic thinking, which held that government should maintain balanced budgets and let markets clear naturally. Keynesian policies would dominate for decades, though they would be challenged in the 1970s and after. Internationally, the Depression taught the importance of cooperation and the dangers of economic nationalism. The beggar-thy-neighbour policies of the 1930s, competitive devaluations, trade barriers, each country trying to protect itself at others' expense, had made the Depression worse for everyone. After World War II, America led the creation of international institutions, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank. The General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, designed to promote cooperation and prevent another global economic collapse. The Depression demonstrated the interconnectedness of the global economy. A crash in New York affected farmers in Iowa, workers in Germany, peasants in China. This interconnection meant problems anywhere could become problems everywhere. It also meant solutions required international coordination. This lesson would need to be relearned repeatedly as new crises emerged. For American culture, the Depression left complex legacies. It created a sense of shared experience, of national ordeal overcome together. The stories people told about the Depression, surviving on nothing, helping neighbors, making do, became part of American mythology. But this mythology sometimes simplified or sanitized the experience, forgetting the bitterness, the divisions, the failures. The Depression also revealed the best and worst of human nature. There was extraordinary solidarity and compassion, people sharing what little they had, communities supporting each other, a sense that we're all in this together. But there was also scapegoating, discrimination, cruelty. Some people hoarded while others starved. Some exploited desperation for profit. The Depression showed that crisis doesn't automatically produce nobility or solidarity. It reveals and intensifies whatever tendencies already exist in society. For economics as a discipline, the Depression was a watershed. The theories that had guided policy before 1929 failed to predict the crash or prescribe effective solutions. New theories emerged, Keynesianism most prominently, that tried to explain what had gone wrong and how to prevent it from happening again. Economics became more empirical, more focused on data and measurement, more engaged with policy. The Depression made economics matter in a way it hadn't before. The question of whether the Depression could happen again has been debated ever since. The regulatory framework created in the 1930s was supposed to prevent another such collapse, and indeed the post-war period saw much greater economic stability than the pre-Depression era. But financial crises continued to occur. The savings and loan crisis of the 1980s, the dot-com bubble of the late 1990s, the 2008 financial crisis. Each demonstrated that financial systems remain vulnerable to excess and panic, that regulation can be weakened or circumvented, that vigilance is required. The 2008 crisis was particularly significant because it was the worst economic downturn since the Depression. Policymakers explicitly drew on Depression-era lessons. The Federal Reserve aggressively expanded the money supply rather than contracting it. Governments engaged in stimulus spending. There was international coordination. These actions, controversial as they were, likely prevented 2008 from becoming another Depression-level catastrophe. The lessons of the 1930s, it seemed, had been learned well enough to avoid complete repetition. But 2008 also revealed that the New Deal consensus had frayed. The social safety net, while still present, was weaker than it had been. Labour unions had declined dramatically. Financial regulation had been loosened. Inequality had risen to levels not seen since the 1920s. Some of the protections built in response to the Depression had been dismantled or weakened, based on theories that markets could regulate themselves better than government could regulate them. The Great Depression remains relevant not just as history, but as cautionary tale and guide. It shows how quickly prosperity can collapse when financial systems become unstable. It demonstrates the social and political consequences of mass unemployment and poverty. It reveals the challenges of responding to crisis, the difficulty of coordination, the limits of conventional wisdom, the need for experimentation and adaptation. And it shows both the possibilities and limitations of government action, what can be accomplished when political will exists, and how political and social structures constrain even well-intentioned reform. As we move toward the end of our exploration, carry these lessons lightly. The Depression was specific to its time, shaped by particular circumstances that won't repeat exactly. But human nature, the dynamics of financial markets, the challenges of governance, these remain relevant. The Depression speaks to us still, if we listen. Let's turn now from the broad sweep of history to the intimate scale of individual lives. Because the Depression, for all the statistics and policies we've discussed, was ultimately experienced by millions of people as personal story, as lived experience with all its complexity and contradiction. Consider Meridel Lesueur, a writer who documented Depression-era life. She wrote about standing in employment offices watching women's desperation, their quiet dignity, their small strategies for survival. She captured how women supported each other, shared information about where work might be found, offered comfort when hope failed. Her writing preserved voices that might otherwise have been forgotten, not the famous or powerful, but ordinary women trying to survive. Or think about Woody Guthrie, the folk singer who rode the rails, worked in migrant camps, sang songs about the Dust Bowl and the people it displaced. This Land Is Your Land started as a protest song, a challenge to the complacent patriotism of God Bless America. Guthrie's original verses, often omitted now, asked pointed questions about private property and inequality. His life embodied the Depression experience, constant movement, intermittent work, artistic creation born from hardship. Dorothea Lange interviewed Florence Owens Thompson years after taking the famous, quote, 65 photograph. Thompson had mixed feelings about the image that made her an icon of depression suffering. She felt exploited. The photograph had become famous, but she received nothing, remained poor. Yet she also took pride in representing migrant workers' dignity. Her ambivalence reminds us that being photographed, documented, turned into symbol can feel both validating and violating. Consider the letters that flooded into the White House during the 1930s. Ordinary Americans wrote to Eleanor and Franklin Roosevelt, sometimes addressing them like family members, sharing their struggles, asking for help. These letters, preserved in archives, are heartbreaking in their directness. Dear Mrs. Roosevelt, I am writing to ask if you might send us some clothes for our children, as they have none warm enough for winter. Mr. President, I am a veteran, and I have been seeking work for 2 years without success. Can you help me find employment? The assumption that the President might personally respond shows both desperation and a kind of faith that someone in power might care. Some letters expressed anger rather than supplication. Working people who felt betrayed by the system, by employers who had promised security and then abandoned them. Veterans who had fought for their country and felt they deserved better. People who were tired of being told the Depression was their own fault, that they just needed to try harder. The rage in some of these letters is palpable even decades later. There were also the stories of survival and ingenuity. Families who created elaborate systems of barter and exchange when cash disappeared. Communities that organized cooperative gardens, shared childcare, pooled resources. People who discovered talents and strengths they didn't know they had. A man who lost his business but discovered he could repair almost anything, becoming the neighborhood fix-it person. A woman who started baking bread to sell and found she was feeding half her community. Children who grew up during the Depression carried particular memories, playing with homemade toys because store-bought ones were impossible luxuries, wearing clothes made from flour sacks, learning not to complain about perpetual hunger, understanding from their parents' worried faces that asking for things would only add to the burden. Some remembered it as a time of closeness. Families pulled together, made their own entertainment, talked more because they couldn't afford distractions. Others remembered mainly the tension, the fear, the sense that their childhoods had been stolen by circumstances they couldn't understand. For elderly people during the Depression, the experience was often particularly bitter. After working their entire lives, they faced poverty in old age, dependent on children who could barely support themselves. The indignity of it, having contributed to society for decades, only to be discarded when they could no longer work. Some elderly people quietly gave up, willing themselves to die rather than continue being burdens. Others fought fiercely for survival, angry at a world that had betrayed its implicit promises. Young adults faced different challenges. Those who came of age during the Depression found normal life markers, graduating, starting careers, marrying, having children, delayed indefinitely. Couples who wanted to marry waited years until they could afford it. Young men rode the rails looking for work that didn't exist. Young women took whatever employment they could find, often in domestic service or factory work that didn't match their education or ambitions. African Americans had additional layers of hardship and humiliation. A black professional man unable to find work appropriate to his education because of discrimination. A black family denied relief benefits available to white families in similar circumstances. The constant navigation of Jim Crow restrictions while also dealing with depression hardships. Yet there were also stories of black communities supporting their own, of churches and mutual aid societies providing help when government programs failed or excluded them. In some ways, the Depression revealed fundamental truths about identity and values. People discovered who they were when everything external was stripped away. Some found unexpected reserves of strength and resilience. Others broke under the pressure. Marriages either grew stronger through shared struggle or collapsed under the strain. Communities either came together or fragmented into suspicion and blame. There's no single depression story because there were millions of depression stories, each unique, each true to those who lived it. The rich detail of individual experience, the taste of watery soup in a breadline, the feeling of cardboard in worn-out shoes, the sound of a father crying in the next room, the smell of dust during a black blizzard, the relief of finally finding work, the joy of a child's laughter despite everything. This is what made the Depression real for those who experienced it. Statistics tell us about scope and scale. Personal stories tell us about meaning and memory. We need both to understand what happened. The Great Depression has become myth as much as history, a story America tells itself about resilience and recovery. Let's explore how the memory of the Depression was shaped and what purposes that mythology serves. The dominant narrative that emerged, particularly after World War II, was one of triumph over adversity. Americans had faced the worst economic crisis in history and survived. They had pulled together, supported each other, and with the help of wise leadership overcome. This narrative emphasized unity, resilience, and ultimate success. It was comforting and inspirational. But it was also selective, highlighting certain aspects while minimizing others. The mythology often centers on the New Deal as salvation, with Roosevelt as the hero who rescued America. There's truth in this. Roosevelt's leadership did make a difference. The New Deal did help millions of people. But the mythology simplifies a much more complex reality. The New Deal was improvised, sometimes contradictory, often excluded significant groups, and didn't actually end the Depression. The war ended the Depression, not New Deal policies, though those policies did alleviate suffering and create lasting institutions. Another strand of Depression mythology emphasizes individual resilience and ingenuity. Stories of entrepreneurs who started successful businesses during hard times, of people who refused to give up, who made something from nothing through determination and creativity. These stories are true and admirable, but they can feed into a dangerous narrative that the Depression was primarily a test of character, that those who suffered simply didn't try hard enough. This ignores the structural nature of the crisis. No amount of individual virtue could create jobs that didn't exist. The Greatest Generation mythology ties together those who lived through the Depression and fought in World War II, presenting them as uniquely tough, selfless, and capable. Tom Brokaw's book of that title popularized this view. There's something to it. People who survived the Depression and won World War II did accomplish remarkable things. But the mythology can become oppressive. creating unrealistic standards and dismissing the struggles of later generations as trivial by comparison. Popular culture has shaped Depression memory significantly. Films like The Grapes of Wrath and It's a Wonderful Life present particular visions of the era. Music from the period, swing, blues, folk, carries associations. These cultural artifacts are powerful memory makers, but they're selective. Quote 71, for instance, is about a savings and loan crisis and community solidarity, but it's remembered primarily as a heartwarming Christmas story. Its Depression-era setting almost incidental. Photographs, particularly the FSA images we discussed earlier, have become iconic. Migrant mother, breadlines, Dust Bowl scenes, these images define the Depression visually. But they can also flatten the experience into a few dramatic moments, missing the grinding, everyday nature of Depression hardship, the years of slow struggle that didn't photograph dramatically. Family stories passed down through generations shape personal memory of the Depression. These stories become family mythology, often simplified and polished over time. Details that are shameful or painful get edited out. The story becomes about survival and resilience, less about fear and desperation. This isn't dishonest exactly. Memory naturally does this. But it changes how the Depression is understood by those who didn't live through it. Political uses of Depression memory have varied. Liberals invoke it to justify social programs and government intervention. Conservatives use it to warn against excessive regulation and spending. Both sides cite Roosevelt, either as example to emulate or mistake to avoid. The Depression becomes ammunition in contemporary political debates, with each side claiming the quote, 75 lessons support their position. The mythology sometimes erases or minimizes the experiences of those who suffered most. The particular hardships of Black Americans, Native Americans, Mexican Americans, and other marginalized groups get lost in narratives about national unity and shared sacrifice. The fact that New Deal programs often excluded or discriminated against these groups is uncomfortable for a triumphant narrative, so it's sometimes glossed over. There's also a nostalgia element that's somewhat perverse. Some people romanticize the Depression as a time when life was simpler, when people helped each other, when families were close. This nostalgia conveniently forgets the suffering, the hunger, disease, hopelessness, families torn apart by poverty. It's easier to be nostalgic for community and simplicity when you're not actually living through deprivation. The mythology serves purposes, though. It provides inspiration. If America survived the Depression, it can survive other crises. It offers lessons about the importance of financial regulation, social safety nets, the dangers of inequality. It creates shared national identity. The Depression is part of what it means to be American, a collective memory even for those who didn't experience it directly. But mythology can also distort. When we remember the Depression as a story with a clear beginning, middle, and heroic resolution, we miss the ambiguity, the ongoing struggles, the incompleteness of solutions. When we focus on individual resilience, we might neglect structural problems. When we emphasize what was accomplished, we might forget what was left undone. The challenge is to hold both history and mythology in mind, to understand what actually happened while also acknowledging how it's been remembered and why. The Depression was worse than mythology suggests in some ways, more complex, more compromised, less completely resolved. But it was also exactly what mythology suggests in other ways, a test of society that revealed both failures and capabilities, a crisis that produced both suffering and solidarity, a moment that changed America forever. As we move deeper into reflection, let's consider what was lost during the Great Depression, not just economically, but culturally, psychologically, in terms of human potential and social fabric. The most obvious losses were material. Homes foreclosed, farms lost, businesses shuttered, savings wiped out. Families lost possessions accumulated over generations: furniture, jewellery, keepsakes, photographs. These material losses represented not just economic value but memory and identity. A grandmother's china passed down through generations, sold for pennies to buy food. A family Bible with birth and death records, left behind when evicted. These objects carried history and meaning that couldn't be recovered, but material losses, devastating as they were perhaps not the deepest losses. Consider the loss of time, years of productive work that never happened. Young people who should have been starting careers instead rode the rails looking for work. Their 20s disappeared into aimless wandering or dead-end jobs unrelated to their abilities or education. That time, that potential, could never be recovered. They would always be behind, always marked by those lost years. The loss of health was significant and often permanent. Malnutrition during childhood affects development in ways that last a lifetime. Children who grew up hungry during the Depression were shorter, sicker, died younger than they should have. Mental health deteriorated under the strain. Depression, anxiety, what we'd now call PTSD, these conditions were common but rarely treated. People just had to endure, had to keep going despite psychological wounds that never healed. Relationships were lost or damaged. Families torn apart when fathers left to look for work and never came back. When children were sent to live with relatives who might be able to feed them. When marriages collapsed under financial strain and the stress of constant worry. Some of these relationships were later restored, but others weren't. The damage was permanent. Trust was lost. Trust in institutions, in promises, in the future. People who had believed that hard work would be rewarded, that saving was wise, that banks were safe, that the economic system was sound. All these beliefs were shattered. The loss of trust is harder to quantify than the loss of money, but perhaps more consequential. A society runs on trust, on shared assumptions and expectations. When trust collapses, everything becomes more difficult. Dreams were lost. Young couples who postponed marriage indefinitely. People who had to abandon education. Artists who never created the work they might have because they were too busy surviving. Inventors, entrepreneurs, scientists, teachers, people whose contributions to society were lost because the Depression derailed their lives. We can never know what wasn't created, what innovations didn't happen, what beauty wasn't made because potential was crushed by circumstance. A kind of innocence was lost, the optimistic faith in progress and prosperity that had characterized the 1920s. The idea that each generation would automatically be better off than the last, that America's trajectory was always upward, that the future would inevitably be brighter. The Depression destroyed these assumptions. They would eventually be rebuilt in the post-war years, but they were never quite as unquestioned again. There was a loss of diversity in some ways. Small businesses that gave communities distinctive character disappeared, replaced by larger chains or by nothing at all. Local banks that knew their communities were absorbed by larger institutions or failed entirely. The Depression accelerated economic consolidation that reduced variety and local control. Main streets across America became more similar, less unique. Traditional ways of life were lost. Small family farms that had sustained families for generations became unviable, forcing migration to cities. Artisan crafts and skills were abandoned as mass production, and economic necessity made them impractical. Communities that had existed for decades emptied out as people left looking for work elsewhere. Dust Bowl towns literally disappeared, swallowed by blowing sand, their population scattered across the country. The experience of community in its pre-Depression form was changed. Before the Depression, communities were more self-contained, more locally focused. The Depression forced people to look beyond their communities for solutions, to the federal government, to national programs. This wasn't necessarily bad, but it represented a loss of local autonomy and the particular kind of solidarity that comes from local self-reliance. For individuals, there was loss of identity and purpose. Men who defined themselves by their work, their ability to provide for families, lost that identity when they lost their jobs. The shame and emasculation they felt was a real loss, even if the gender norms that created that shame were themselves problematic. Women who saw themselves as homemakers found that role challenged when they had to work outside the home, or when they couldn't maintain a proper home due to poverty. These identity crises, while potentially opening space for new ways of being, were experienced as loss. There was also loss of joy. Years of childhood should have been spent in play and learning, but instead were consumed by worry and want. Young adults should have been falling in love, exploring possibilities, taking risks. But instead were focused on mere survival. Even the elderly, who should have been enjoying retirement, instead faced their final years in poverty and fear. The Depression stole ordinary human happiness from millions of people. Some of what was lost needed to be lost. Unsustainable economic practices, cruel inequalities, unjust systems, these deserved to fall apart. But they fell apart in a way that caused enormous collateral damage, hurting millions who weren't responsible for the problems. It would have been better to reform systems deliberately, carefully, protecting people while changing structures. Instead, crisis forced change in catastrophic, painful ways. The Depression reminds us that loss isn't always about what can be measured or recovered. Economic statistics eventually improved, but the people who lived through those years carried the scars forever. The generation that experienced the Depression was shaped by loss in ways that affected how they lived the rest of their lives, how they raised their children, what they valued and feared. Loss like that echoes across generations, becomes part of family history and national memory. We can document what was lost materially, what was lost psychologically, spiritually, in terms of human flourishing, that we can never fully calculate. Yet alongside all the loss, alongside all the suffering, the Depression also revealed extraordinary human resilience and capacity for adaptation. Let's explore how people didn't just endure, but also found ways to maintain humanity, dignity, even joy, in circumstances that might have broken them. Consider the creativity people displayed in simply surviving. When money disappeared, they created alternative economies. Barter systems emerged organically. I'll fix your roof if you'll help me repair my car. Communities developed informal networks of mutual aid where people traded skills and goods without cash changing hands. These weren't systematic or organized. Just people figuring out how to meet needs when normal economic transactions were impossible. Families became remarkably resourceful. Women learned to remake adult clothes into children's clothes, then remake them again as children grew. They saved buttons, zippers, any piece of hardware that might be reused. They learned to cook with minimal ingredients, creating filling meals from potatoes, beans, flour. Men learned to repair things they'd previously have replaced: shoes, furniture, tools, appliances. Waste became intolerable. Everything was used fully, repaired repeatedly, repurposed when it could no longer serve its original function. People maintained culture and community even in hardship. Churches and community centres organised social events that cost little or nothing. Amateur theatres, glee clubs, book discussion groups. These provided entertainment and connection. Neighbours gathered on porches in warm weather, talking to pass time, sharing what they had. These social bonds were both practical, you might need help from these neighbours, and emotionally necessary. There was humour, surprisingly. Gallows humour, yes, jokes about poverty and hardship that let people laugh at circumstances they couldn't change, but also genuine playfulness, refusal to let the depression crush all joy. Children played games with homemade toys, creating elaborate imaginary worlds. Adults found ways to celebrate occasions, birthdays, holidays, even when they couldn't afford traditional celebrations. A cake made from Depression-era recipes with minimal ingredients, candles carefully saved from year to year, the ritual of gathering and marking the occasion even when there were no gifts. Some people discovered new talents and purposes during the Depression. A man who lost his white-collar job might find satisfaction in physical labour, in building or fixing things with his hands. A woman who had always been a housewife might discover entrepreneurial skills, starting a small business from her kitchen. The Depression forced people out of established patterns, and while this was generally traumatic, it occasionally revealed capabilities and interests they wouldn't have otherwise discovered. Communities sometimes came together in remarkable ways. In some places, when a family faced eviction, neighbours would gather not to protest but to bid at the auction, bidding only pennies for items, then returning everything to the family. It was a form of collective resistance and mutual aid that authorities couldn't easily prevent. When farmers faced foreclosure, neighbours sometimes intimidated potential buyers or bid so low that farms could be saved. These were small victories, but they mattered. Political organising and activism increased. People who might have been politically passive became active, joining unions, attending rallies, demanding change. The Depression politicised many people, showing them that personal problems were actually social problems requiring collective solutions. This led to the labour movement growth we discussed earlier, but also to broader civic engagement. People learned they weren't powerless, that organising could create change. Artists found ways to create even in poverty. Writers wrote, musicians played, painters painted, often with minimal materials and no prospect of profit. Art was a way of making meaning, of asserting humanity, of documenting experience. The fact that so much remarkable art emerged from the Depression years testifies to the human need to create even in, perhaps especially in, hard times. Education continued despite obstacles. Teachers often worked without pay when school districts ran out of money, believing their work mattered regardless. Students attended school even when they were hungry, even when they had to walk miles, even when their clothes were ragged. The commitment to education, to improvement, to hope for the future persisted. Public libraries were treasured resources free to all, providing books, warmth in winter, quiet space, escape from crowded homes. People maintained moral frameworks and values. Yes, there was crime and exploitation, but there was also widespread honesty and mutual respect. In hobo jungles and migrant camps, informal codes of conduct emerged. You shared food if you had extra. You didn't steal from others in similar circumstances. You helped newcomers learn the rules. These codes weren't always followed, but they existed, representing attempts to maintain civilization even in dire conditions. Religious faith sustained many people. Churches provided not just spiritual comfort but practical assistance. Food pantries, clothing distribution, help finding work. For many, faith offered explanation, or at least acceptance of suffering, a framework for understanding why bad things happened. Hope that justice or reward would come in an afterlife if not in this one. Whether or not this was objectively true, it helped people endure. The resilience displayed during the Depression suggests something profound about human nature. We are adaptable beyond what we imagine. We can survive circumstances that seem unbearable. We maintain humanity even when reduced to subsistence. We find ways to create meaning and connection, and even joy in the worst situations. This isn't to romanticize suffering. The Depression was terrible and didn't need to happen. But having happened, people responded with remarkable strength. This resilience had costs, of course. People who survived developed permanent anxieties, never felt completely secure again, carried psychological scars, but they survived. They adapted. They created lives, raised children, built communities, contributed to society. They demonstrated that while circumstances can destroy much, they can't destroy everything. The human spirit, while it can be bent and damaged, is harder to break than systems or economies. As we approach the end of our journey, let's consider how the Great Depression's shadow stretched across the rest of the 20th century and into our own time. Because the Depression didn't just end when prosperity returned. Its effects rippled outward, shaping decades that followed. For the generation that lived through it, the Depression was the defining experience of their lives. Even those who later achieved prosperity never quite forgot what it felt like to be hungry, unemployed, insecure. They made decisions based on Depression-era lessons, saving obsessively, avoiding debt, being suspicious of financial institutions, living below their means even when they could afford more. These were rational responses to trauma, but they also shaped the economy in the post-war decades. The political landscape was permanently altered. The New Deal coalition, labor unions, urban ethnic communities, African Americans, white Southerners, intellectuals, dominated democratic politics for decades. Republicans, to compete, had to accept the basic framework of the New Deal state even as they argued for modification or restraint. Both parties accepted that government had responsibility for economic management and social welfare. This consensus, sometimes called the quote, 76 quote, or quote, 77 quote, lasted roughly from the 1930s through the 1970s. Social Security, which began as a modest program, expanded over time to become the most popular government program. Attempts to cut or privatize it have consistently met fierce political resistance. Politicians learned that, quote, 78 quote is political suicide. The program has grown to provide not just retirement benefits but disability insurance, survivors' benefits, a foundation of economic security that previous generations couldn't have imagined. Labor unions, strengthened by New Deal legislation, reached peak influence and membership in the 1950s. This was a key factor in the post-war economic boom. Union workers earned middle-class wages, could buy homes and cars, could send children to college. The unionized working class created mass consumer demand that drove economic growth. When unions later declined from the 1970s onward, wage stagnation and inequality increased, partially reversing Depression-era gains. Financial regulation created during the Depression, particularly the Glass-Steagall Act separating commercial and investment banking, helped maintain financial stability for decades. When these regulations were loosened or repealed in the 1980s and 1990s, financial instability increased, culminating in the 2008 crisis. The cycle repeated: deregulation, excessive risk-taking, crisis, then renewed calls for regulation. The Depression's lessons about financial regulation had to be relearned. The Depression influenced how economists thought about macroeconomic policy. Keynesian ideas dominated academic economics and policymaking for decades. The idea that government should engage in counter-cyclical policy, stimulating during recessions, restraining during booms, became orthodox. The Federal Reserve took on an expanded role in economic management. This framework was challenged in the 1970s by stagflation, simultaneous inflation and unemployment, leading to new theories and policies, but Depression-era insights remained influential. Infrastructure built by Depression-era programs, dams, bridges, schools, post offices, continued to serve America for decades. The Hoover Dam still generates electricity. The Tennessee Valley Authority still operates. Roads and bridges built by the WPA are still in use. These physical legacies are reminders that public investment can create value that lasts generations. The Depression shaped American culture in lasting ways. It created a certain sensibility, skepticism toward unbridled capitalism, sympathy for the underdog, belief in collective responsibility. This sensibility influenced literature, film, music, political discourse for decades. It slowly faded as subsequent generations didn't directly experience hardship, but traces remained. World War II veterans benefited from the G. Bill, which was influenced by Depression-era recognition that government should support citizens. The GI Bill provided education benefits and home loans that helped create the post-war middle class. This was economic policy as much as veterans policy. Putting money and opportunity into the hands of millions of people stimulated the economy, while also fulfilling a social contract. The civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s was influenced by Depression-era activism. Black workers who had participated in labor organizing during the 1930s applied those lessons to civil rights organizing. The recognition that collective action could challenge unjust systems, learned during Depression struggles, informed later movements for social justice. The unfinished business of the New Deal, its racial exclusions and compromises, created agenda items for later reformers. The war on poverty in the 1960s was explicitly modelled on New Deal approaches. Government programs to address social problems focus on structural solutions rather than individual failings. Programs like Medicare, Medicaid, food stamps expanded Social Security. These extended the New Deal framework. Whether they succeeded is debated, but they represented the same basic approach, using government power and resources to reduce suffering and create opportunity. The conservative reaction of the 1970s and 1980s was partly a challenge to Depression-era assumptions. Ronald Reagan argued that government was the problem, not the solution, directly contradicting New Deal philosophy. Deregulation, tax cuts, reduced social spending. These policies represented an attempt to roll back the New Deal state. This was only partly successful. Core programs like Social Security remained popular and were politically untouchable, but the expansion of government responsibility was halted and in some areas reversed. The 2008 financial crisis brought Depression comparisons to the forefront. Policymakers explicitly invoked Depression-era lessons. Ben Bernanke, Federal Reserve Chairman and an academic expert on the Depression, used expansionary monetary policy explicitly to avoid repeating Depression-era mistakes. The Obama administration pursued stimulus spending based partly on Keynesian logic developed during the Depression. Whether these policies were adequate or correct is debated, but they showed that the Depression remained a reference point for understanding crisis and crafting response. Current debates about inequality, financial regulation, social programs, the proper role of government, these all echo Depression-era arguments. We're still wrestling with questions that the Depression made urgent. How should markets be regulated? What does society owe to its members? What is the proper balance between individual responsibility and collective support? The Depression didn't answer these questions definitively, but it made them impossible to ignore. The shadow of the Depression also includes what wasn't accomplished. The racial inequalities that the New Deal failed to fully address persisted and evolved. The exclusion of agricultural and domestic workers from protections created lasting disparities. The failure to create universal health care to provide adequate housing for all, to guarantee employment, these were goals articulated during the Depression but never fully achieved. The unfinished agenda remains. As we reach the end of our exploration, the Depression remains present. In memory, in institutions, in political debates, in the stories families tell, in the lessons economists cite, in the fears of older generations who remember or heard about it. It was too big, too transformative, too traumatic to simply be past. It's embedded in American identity and consciousness, a reference point, a warning, a reminder of both vulnerability and resilience, of how bad things can get and how they can be overcome, never completely resolved but always present in the background of national life. And so we've travelled together through the Great Depression, from the glittering heights of the 1920s through the crash, through the long, terrible years of suffering and slow recovery, to the war that finally ended it and the lasting changes it created. We've been on this journey for more than 2 hours now, walking slowly through history, trying to understand what happened and what it meant. When we began, we asked a question. What really happened on those terrible days in October 1929, when the stock market crashed and, according to legend, millionaires threw themselves from Manhattan skyscrapers? And the answer, as honestly as I can give it, is both simpler and more complex than the legend suggests. The crashes, Black Thursday and Black Tuesday, were real and catastrophic. Billions of dollars in wealth vanished. Lives were ruined. But the suicides, while they happened, were fewer and less dramatic than mythology claims. The real tragedy wasn't bodies falling from buildings, but dreams dying slowly, families disintegrating, communities collapsing, years of suffering that didn't make dramatic newspaper stories. The Depression was a long disaster, not a single moment, and its impact was measured not in spectacular deaths, but in grinding everyday hardship that lasted over a decade. We learned that the Depression had many causes: speculation, margin buying, agricultural problems, international financial instability, economic inequality, flawed economic thinking. No single cause, no single villain, but a confluence of factors that created perfect conditions for collapse. We saw how people survived, through creativity and resilience, through mutual aid and government programs, through adaptation and sacrifice. We explored the institutions created in response: social security, financial regulation, labour rights, the modern interventionist state, and we considered what was lost: lives, opportunities, time, trust, joy, and what endured: human dignity, solidarity, the capacity to rebuild. If you've enjoyed this slow drift through history, through economic catastrophe and human resilience, I hope you'll like and subscribe. These calm explorations of profound historical moments exist to help us understand where we came from, how we got here, what we're capable of in both triumph and tragedy. And to those who are already subscribed, who have made this community possible, thank you. Your support allows these stories to be told, these memories to be preserved. Wherever you are in the world right now, in whatever time zone you're watching from, I hope you found something valuable in this story. I hope your breathing has slowed, that the tensions of your day have eased a bit. I hope the weight of your own worries feels lighter, placed in context of what others have endured and overcome. The depression was terrible. It didn't need to happen. The suffering was real and often preventable, but people survived it. They maintained humanity. They created beauty and meaning even in hardship. They rebuilt, and the institutions and lessons that emerged, imperfect as they were, created a more stable, more just, more secure society. Not perfect, never perfect, but better than what came before. If you're lying down now, let yourself sink a little deeper into your mattress. If you're sitting, let your shoulders drop. Take a slow breath. The depression is long over. The people who suffered through it have mostly passed now. But their stories remain. Their lessons endure. Their resilience inspires us. We remember them. Honor them by trying to learn from what they experienced. Look up at the stars if you can, or imagine them if you can't see them from where you are. Those same stars shone down on the Hoovervilles and the breadlines, on the Dust Bowl and the migrant camps, on the people who suffered and survived. The stars witnessed everything, indifferent but constant, and they outlasted the depression as they'll outlast us. There's something comforting in that perspective, in the reminder that our crises, however terrible, are moments in a much longer story, that humanity has survived before and will again, that suffering ends even when it seems eternal. The Great Depression taught us that prosperity is fragile, that systems can fail, that individual virtue isn't enough to ensure security. But it also taught us that people are strong, that societies can change, that compassion and solidarity are possible even in the worst times. These lessons remain relevant. The specific circumstances won't repeat exactly, but the underlying truths about human nature, about economic systems, about what we owe each other, these endure. Sleep well tonight. Dream perhaps of that moment in 1929 when everything seemed possible, when the future seemed bright and unlimited. Hold that optimism, but temper it with the wisdom the Depression taught, that we must take care of each other, that systems need safeguards, that prosperity should be shared, that we're all vulnerable to forces larger than ourselves. Hold both the hope and the caution. Both are true. Both are necessary. Good night, wherever you are. Thank you for spending this time with me, for listening to this long story of collapse and recovery, of suffering and resilience. May your sleep be deep and peaceful. May you wake to a world that learned something from the Depression, that remembers, that tries not to repeat the worst mistakes. And may you carry forward the best of what that generation taught us, the resilience, the solidarity, the refusal to surrender to despair. Sleep well, dream of better times. Good night.